Would you be willing to change your life for someone special? Los Angeles was waking up slowly that Tuesday morning, the gridlocked streets filling the air with a steady hum of engines and horns. Emily Clark sat in the backseat of a taxi, watching the skyscrapers rise around her. Her eyes captured the brightness of the city, but her heart beat unsteadily, almost as if it wanted to remind her that this was not a casual walk. Dressed in a simple but elegantly tailored ensemble, she carried a portfolio in hand, her only chance of getting the contract she so desperately needed to continue her small clothing brand, Clark Designs. Taking a deep breath, she struggled to control her anxiety. Since she was little, Emily dreamed of becoming a successful fashion designer. She had grown up in a small town, far from the spotlight and the catwalks, but her mother always believed in her. It was from her that she inherited the ability to sew, which led her to leave everything behind in search of her dream in Los Angeles. The problem was that life in the big city had turned out to be much more challenging than she had imagined. After years of working hard and building her little brand, Emily was on the verge of bankruptcy. Competition was fierce, costs were high, and visibility was almost non-existent. The taxi stopped in front of the luxurious building where the fashion event was taking place. Emily paid the driver and got out with her heart racing. He took a deep breath and entered the room, his eyes capturing the impeccably decorated environment. The walls were covered in flower arrangements and flowing curtains, while cocktail tables were strategically placed, surrounded by influential people from the worlds of fashion and business. Her goal was simple but arduous. She needed to attract the attention of Orlean Designs, one of the largest fashion companies in the country. Orlean had recently announced a project to support young talent, and Emily knew that if she could convince them to invest in her brand, she had a real chance of saving her business. She approached the reception, handed over her identification card, and was led to a waiting room where other candidates were already there. Well-dressed men and women occupied the leather chairs, all looking as eager as she did. Beside her, a young blonde man with perfectly coiffed hair and a self-confident smile looked at her and gave her a friendly wink. She returned the nervous smile, feeling a little out of place in such a formal environment. A few minutes passed, and finally she was called. He stood up with his portfolio firmly in his hands and followed the receptionist down a long, silent corridor to an imposing room with floor-to-ceiling windows, which offered a spectacular view of the city. When she entered, she realized she was not alone. A man was sitting in the center of the table, fiddling with some documents. He looked up, and Emily felt an internal shock. He was elegant, with perfectly coiffed dark brown hair and intense eyes. His posture was impeccable, and his gaze was cold and appraising. It was clear that it wasn't just anyone. That was Ethan Cooper, CEO of Cooper Holdings, one of the largest investment firms in the country. She knew who he was. His name was constantly in business magazines and at charity events that attracted media attention. He was famous for his ability to turn any investment into success, but also for his coldness and apparent lack of patience for amateurs. Ethan watched her for a moment before briefly gesturing for her to sit down. Emily slid into the chair, trying to contain her nervousness. As he settled in, he flipped through some documents with an unreadable expression. "So, Miss Clark," he began, without looking up from the papers, "why should we invest in your brand?" The question was direct, almost harsh, but Emily took a deep breath and tried to answer with confidence. "My brand is unique. We work with sustainable fabrics and invest in authentic designs. I want to offer people clothes that represent more than one style. I want each piece to tell a story." Ethan looked up and stared at her with a vacant expression, but Emily noticed a slight interest. She continued, trying not to let the intensity of his gaze intimidate her. "I know that the fashion market is competitive and that there are big names succeeding, but my vision goes beyond that. I want to build a brand that respects the environment, that inspires people to express themselves, and at the same time, represents innovation." For a second, she thought she saw something soften in Ethan's eyes, but it was so quick she couldn't be sure. He remained silent, as if pondering his words, and then set the portfolio aside. "Sounds like a promising idea," he said. although his tone remained distant. However, ideas are not enough. We're here to talk business. What is your plan to turn this into profit? That question caught Emily by surprise. She had prepared a presentation on the essence of her brand, but was still struggling to gather funds and expand large-scale production. Hesitantly, he began to explain his plan, detailing his marketing strategy and his ideas for attracting customers. But the more she talked, the more she realized he wasn't convinced. At the end of his explanation, Ethan let out a discreet sigh, as if he was about to end the conversation. "Miss Clark, you are talented, but I must be honest. Investing in a small, unstructured brand may be a risk that my company is not willing to take." Her heart skipped a beat. He felt discouragement taking over, but something in his posture changed. She decided to be honest. "I know that my brand is still small and that I have a lot to learn, but if you give me a chance, I promise you won't regret it. I just need an opportunity to show what I'm capable of." The intensity of her words seemed to surprise Ethan. He was silent for a moment, as if considering the proposal, and then something unexpected happened. One of the assistants rushed into the room, interrupting whatever Ethan was about to say. "Mr. Cooper, I'm sorry for the interruption," said the assistant, with an air of urgency, "but you have a meeting with Mr. Westwood in 15 minutes. Ethan nodded, but his eyes returned to Emily, and he seemed lost in thought. When the assistant left, he let out a slight sigh, and after a moment, he picked up a blank sheet of paper. "I'll be honest, Miss Clark," he said, in a lower, more serious tone. "I am in a delicate situation at the moment. There are investors with whom I need to close an important contract, and there is a specific clause that requires me to be married." Emily blinked, confused. That seemed absurd. "And what does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up and looked at her firmly. "I want to propose a contract. You pretend to be my wife for a few months, and in return, I fund your brand and give you the support you need to grow." Emily was stunned. This was insane. She had just met him, and the idea of pretending to be the wife of a strict, stolid CEO like Ethan Cooper seemed surreal. "That sounds crazy," she said, breathless. Ethan smiled slightly, although his eyes remained cold. "Yes, it probably is, but you need a chance. And I need someone I can trust to make this contract feel real." She stood up, her hands shaking as she looked at him. He was in a difficult position, and he knew it. "I knew she was desperate, but I also knew that she had talent and determination. What he didn't know was whether she would agree to do something so out of the ordinary." After a long silence, Emily took a deep breath. "I need time to think," he nodded. "Of course, but not much." Emily left the meeting stunned. The proposal that Ethan Cooper had just made still echoed in his mind like a surreal dream. "You pretend to be my wife for a few months, and in return, I finance your brand." That sounded more like the plot of a movie than an actual offer. As she walked out of the building, clutching her portfolio to her chest, she tried to organize her thoughts and understand what she felt. A mixture of indignation, surprise, and a strange sense of relief. As soon as she stepped onto the busy sidewalk, the fresh Los Angeles air brought her back to reality. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself. He looked around, trying to take in what he had just heard. The decision he proposed was risky, absurd, and to his own amazement, tempting. Ethan Cooper had given her what seemed like a magical solution to her problems, and all she had to do was pretend to be his wife. She felt conflicted, as if one part of her was screaming to run away from this insane idea as quickly as possible, while another was coldly weighing the benefits of this proposal. That night, in her small apartment, Emily made herself a cup of tea as she relived every detail of her conversation with Ethan. Sitting on the sofa, hugging a pillow and watching the city lights through the window, her gaze was thoughtful. There was a lot at stake, and she needed to be practical. On the one hand, Ethan's proposal meant a financial boost that could not only save his brand, but also open the doors to the growth he had always sought. On the other, she was involved in a dangerous game with a man she knew little, risking her own peace to help someone whose coldness still intrigued and frightened her. She picked up her cell phone and for a moment considered calling her best friend Rachel and telling her about the proposal, but he felt that by saying it out loud, the proposal would sound even more absurd and would likely receive a flood of advice against it. Rachel was loyal, but also practical and suspicious. Emily knew her friend would say that accepting an offer like that was crazy. Maybe it was, but at the same time, she felt strangely tempted. It was an opportunity I would never have had otherwise. Ethan was a practical, cold, and direct man, with a stance that bordered on arrogance. But his proposal had come with a promise, a real investment that, in the situation she was in, seemed impossible to refuse. Since the beginning of her career, Emily had heard many times that the business world was a battlefield and that great achievements often required sacrifices. That thought ignited a determination she hadn't felt in a while. "Maybe I can handle him," she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. The next morning, Emily got ready with more care than usual. She chose an elegant but discreet outfit and opted for a touch of makeup that highlighted her features. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, he took a deep breath. It was as if he was preparing for a parachute jump. All he needed was the courage to launch himself. When she arrived at the Cooper Holdings building, she was led to the reception desk of Ethan's office. The environment was quiet and sophisticated, with minimalist decor that reflected the meticulous personality of her future husband. A few minutes later, the glass door opened, and Ethan appeared. He was impeccably dressed as always, and watched her with a look that mixed curiosity and professional interest. Without many words, he led her to his room and indicated for her to sit down. As he settled behind the desk, Emily noticed that he was watching her intensely, as if trying to gauge every detail of her reaction before she even spoke. "Have you decided on the proposal?" Ethan asked bluntly, looking at her with his cold, analytical eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure and ignore the chill she felt running down her spine as she looked at him. "It still seems like an unusual idea, to say the least," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "But I understand that this is the solution that you believe to be most viable to resolve your situation." Ethan showed a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but the intensity in his gaze remained. "Unusual, yes," he agreed, without taking his eyes off her. "But we are both in a position where we need unusual solutions. I can offer the investment you need, but in return, I need our relationship to feel genuine. We need to be seen together in public, act like a couple, and—" He hesitated for a second, and his tone softened slightly. "Trust each other." The word trust sounded strange to Emily's ears, especially coming from someone who seemed so methodical and distant. She sighed and nodded slightly, as if trying to convince herself. As much as her reason screamed not to accept it, something in her heart told her that this was the path she should follow, even if it was a risky bet. "Okay," she said, in a low but firm voice. "I accept." Ethan remained silent for a moment, watching her as if he was processing what he had just heard. Then, he leaned back in his chair and opened a desk drawer, pulling out a thick envelope that he placed in front of it. "This is the contract," he explained, pointing to the envelope. "It is a legal agreement that guarantees the terms of our relationship. The deadline is 6 months. During this period, you will receive the investment you need. But in return, you must play the role of my wife at all social events and business engagements. In the end, we will close the agreement, and everyone will go their own way." Emily took the envelope with shaking hands, trying to absorb what it meant. It was a real contract, with specific terms defining every aspect of the agreement. The words social engagements, public events, and wifely role seemed to jump off the page, as if testing her mettle. She read a few lines in silence, feeling torn between excitement and fear. "All of this is much more detailed than I imagined," she murmured, still processing. Ethan watched her closely, his expression slightly intrigued. It seemed like he was waiting for some reaction, a refusal, or even a hesitation. But Emily surprised him by looking up and looking at him with determination. "If we're going to do this, Mr. Cooper, I want to make sure it's a fair partnership. I'm not just a piece to solve your problems," she said firmly. As she placed the envelope back on the table, a slight smile appeared on his lips, as if he was surprised by her posture. Emily had expected him to see her as someone easily manipulated, but apparently he respected her enough to listen to her. "I wouldn't underestimate you, Miss Clark," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "The proposal is mutual, and if we're going to represent a couple, I want you to be comfortable with the terms." That caught Emily by surprise. She hadn't expected him to be so direct and honest about the intentions of the deal. For the first time, she felt like she could trust him, or at least understand his motives. After a few more minutes of conversation, in which they discussed the final details of the contract, Ethan handed him a pen. "If you agree, sign," he said, with an impassive expression. Emily looked at the pen in her hands, feeling the weight of that decision. Signing meant embarking on a path of no return, but it also meant a future for her brand, something she was willing to risk for. Breathing quickly, she wrote her name on the contract, feeling overcome with a mixture of relief and nervousness. Ethan took the signed contract and with a nod said, "From now on, you are Emily Cooper, my wife." Emily stared at the newly placed signature, as if she didn't believe those letters were hers. It was official. She was now Emily Cooper, Ethan Cooper's wife. By putting an end to that contract, she had embraced something she would never have imagined for herself. Ethan remained silent, watching her for a moment before, with characteristic calm, he closed the contract and put it away. He stood up, heading towards a built-in cabinet behind the desk. He picked up some additional papers and a small set of silver keys, which he handed to her with a formal wave. She held the keys, feeling the weight of the cold metal in her palm, which only solidified the reality of the arrangement. "We need to get started as soon as possible," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "Let's avoid suspicion by being seen together now. And it will also be more convincing if you live with me. We are not just in agreement. From today onwards, we are a couple." He guided her to the elevator without leaving room for any more questions, and she felt her stomach turn. He had barely assimilated the decision to accept the contract, and now he was about to change his life completely. On the way to the underground parking lot, the silence between the two was heavy. Ethan kept his gaze straight ahead, ignoring the curious glances of employees in the hallways. When they arrived at the parking lot, he took her to his car, an impeccable black sedan, where the door was open for her. Ethan drove with precision, keeping the lanes of traffic with meticulous calm. Emily looked out the window, watching the streets of Los Angeles pass by them, the muffled sound of the city inside the car. Finally, they arrived at a luxury condominium in West Hollywood, where a series of modern buildings rose with glass windows and hanging gardens. It was the kind of place she had always dreamed of living in, but knew it was far beyond her means. The elegance of the condominium was intimidating. Ethan guided her to the elevator, where he used a special card that gave direct access to the top floor. They reached the penthouse within seconds, and as they left, Emily felt a pang of discomfort, anticipating what was to come. Upon entering, she came across an environment that looked like it was taken from a decoration magazine. Every detail was meticulously organized and perfectly planned. The neutral colors and straight lines gave the place a cold air, which matched Ethan's personality exactly. He watched her as she took in her surroundings, as if gauging her reactions. "This will be your home for the next few months," he said, breaking the silence. "I want you to feel comfortable, but I need you to understand one thing. I value order and organization. I'm not a person who tolerates mess or improvisation." Emily stopped herself from making an expression of displeasure. That situation seemed increasingly surreal. Not only was she married to a complete stranger, but now she would live under a strict set of rules. Without hiding her dissatisfaction, she looked at him. "I'm a stylist, Ethan," she replied, her voice slightly challenging. "My life is improvisation, creativity, inspiration. I hope you can understand that I am not a machine." He stared at her, eyes narrowed as if trying to interpret what was behind her words. "Then maybe we should start practicing how to deal with differences, since it will be inevitable. We're together now, and we need to act like a real couple. This requires understanding, and in some cases, concessions," he concluded, with a tone that was a mix of warning and patience. Emily noticed that Ethan spoke in such a formal and calculated manner that for a moment, she felt that she was speaking to a superior at work and not the man she had married. The discomfort was palpable, but he gave her no room for hesitation and continued presenting the rooms of the house, describing each one as if you were selling a property. Right after the tour, Ethan left her in the room and went to his office, leaving her alone so she could explore the environment in peace. She spent a few minutes wandering around the apartment, trying to take in every detail of this new scenario. The room was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that seemed to have been chosen based on a strict palette of neutral tones. Yet everything was impersonal and almost cold, as if life and color had been carefully excluded. The books on the shelves were arranged in alphabetical order, and the abstract paintings on the walls seemed more like an exercise in symmetry than an artistic expression. Emily walked to the bedroom they would share and frowned when she saw that the closet was incredibly organized, with suits perfectly aligned on metal hangers and shirts arranged in a chromatic sequence. It looked like some kind of exhibition in a haute couture store. She imagined how challenging it would be for him to get used to her colorful, improvised pieces, the contrast to the artistic chaos that was part of his life. This promised to be complicated. The next day, still trying to adjust to the new routine, Emily woke up and walked to the kitchen, where she found Ethan already dressed for work. He was impeccably aligned, as if every detail was part of a business presentation. It was difficult not to feel small next to someone who seemed to even plan to breathe. She opened one of the cupboards, looking for a mug for her coffee, but almost backed away when she realized that each of the cups was organized according to size and color. She felt a little embarrassed that she had planned to grab the first one she saw, but she tried hard not to let it show. "There is a space reserved for your things," he commented, noticing her embarrassment. "If you need something specific, I can provide it." Emily sighed internally, wishing he would relax a little. Trying to create a more relaxed atmosphere, she decided to make a joke. "Do you happen to have a list of rules for using cups too?" he asked, smiling. Ethan raised an eyebrow, not smiling back. "I would say it is more a matter of common sense. Organization is essential for everything to work. I see no reason why anything should be left to chance," he replied, without realizing her irony. Emily forced a smile, but inside she felt irritated. That coexistence was beginning to test his patience. He decided that he would maintain his essence, regardless of his impositions, but he knew that this would be a silent war. Over the first few weeks, they continued to interact on a daily basis, each trying to adapt to the rhythm and particularities of the other. But the differences soon began to cause small conflicts. Emily loved to improvise when she cooked, and whenever she tried to prepare something for dinner, Ethan questioned the way she organized the ingredients. He had a habit of leaving everything prepared in advance, and was visibly uncomfortable when she moved things around or chose a recipe without planning. One night, while cooking a simple dish, she started mixing the ingredients without following an exact sequence. Ethan, who was in the room, noticed and approached, observing the process with an almost critical eye. "Don't you think it would be more efficient to chop everything before starting to mix?" he suggested, trying not to sound condescending, but failing miserably. Emily took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to roll her eyes. He seemed unable to understand that the kitchen was his creative space, where he liked to experiment without worrying about rules. "Ethan, that's the beauty of the kitchen," she said, her tone light but firm. "Each person has their own way. I like to let myself be carried away by the moment, follow what inspires me. For me, cooking is like creating a new piece of clothing. Inspiration comes instantly." He watched her in silence for a few seconds, seeming to ponder her words. Then he shrugged and walked back into the room, as if he were giving up trying to understand her. For him, it was clear that organization was about efficiency, while for Emily, it was all about expression. That contrast between them seemed impossible to reconcile. However, not everything was conflict. At times, the differences brought situations that made them laugh, like when Emily, when organizing her clothes in the closet, mixed his impeccably arranged shirts with her colorful and voluminous pieces. The next morning, when he saw the closet full of new colors, he stopped, surprised, not knowing whether to express irritation or accept it as a new challenge. Even without meaning to, he laughed when he saw that, among the formal suits, there was now a jacket with floral embroidery, a pink scarf, and a long dress that seemed to take up too much space. Tensions between them, however, were evident. Ethan had a habit of following a rigid and orderly routine, which included waking up at 6 in the morning for a daily run and then reviewing his plan for the day, all without any variation. For Emily, accustomed to flexible schedules and creative chaos, this meticulous routine felt like a prison, and so precisely because of this difference, another conflict arose. One Saturday morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen and found Emily still in her pajamas, filling the counter with clippings from fashion magazines and notes. She barely noticed when he appeared, but soon noticed the slightly disapproving face with which he looked at the mess. "Have you ever thought about organizing this?" he asked, trying to sound neutral. Emily took a deep, frustrated breath. "It's not a mess, it's a brainstorm," he explained with a dose of patience. "I need to visualize everything around me to get ideas. If I keep this in folders, I lose inspiration." Ethan shook his head, still trying to understand. "For me, chaos is a distraction. I prefer the space to be free so I can think better." "It's because you're always thinking about control, Ethan," she replied, letting out her frustration. "Sometimes the best inspiration comes from the unexpected." He stared at her without responding, as if he wasn't sure how to react to that logic. It seemed like he was trying to find a way to accept her point of view, but at the same time, it contradicted everything he had learned about discipline and order. Without saying anything else, he left the kitchen and went to the office, where he spent the rest of the morning. Later that same day, the two went out together for a business dinner, where Ethan needed to introduce her as his wife to some important partners. Emily, who already felt uncomfortable with the situation, was especially nervous. They had fought, and that dinner was the last thing she wanted to face right now. To make matters worse, the environment was rigid and formal, and she felt the critical looks of everyone around her. During the conversation, Ethan's partners asked direct questions about how the two met and about their married life. Ethan, with his usual calmness, kept his answers short and precise, but did not express any emotion. That made Emily even more nervous, as it seemed like everything depended on her for the relationship to ring true. At the end of dinner, she realized that she would have to speak and act like a wife in love with Ethan, something that seemed impossible at that moment. As they left the restaurant, Ethan led her to the car without saying a word. The silence between them was dense, and Emily felt uncomfortable with the emptiness it brought. Before getting into the car, he could no longer hold on. "If we're going to convince someone that we're a couple, maybe it would be good to at least try to seem like you're happy with me," she said, in a tone somewhere between frustration and sarcasm. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the provocation. "Emily, this is a business arrangement. We're not really married. What matters is what others see, not what I feel." She let out an exasperated sigh. "That's exactly what makes it seem so fake. If you can't even show that you're happy with me, no one will believe it. Real couples aren't like that, Ethan. They fight, yes, but they also laugh together. They feel affection for each other. If we're not able to get really close, no one will believe us." He remained silent, pondering her words. For the first time, it felt like something made her more than just part of the contract. Emily wasn't just a piece in the game, and he felt that more keenly than he cared to admit. Ethan knew there was something real in her discomfort, something that, if he wanted the agreement to work, he would also need to learn to cultivate. The ride back was silent. She was tired and disappointed, but still determined to move on from this. After all, as uncomfortable as everything was, there was also the reason that led her to accept the contract, her brand, her dream, and for now, he was worth any sacrifice. On the night of dinner with Ethan's family, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. With every meter that the car advanced towards the Cooper mansion, Ethan drove in silence, his gaze fixed on the road, seemingly calm. But she knew that behind that imperturbable expression, he was as attentive as she was to what that night would mean. It was the first time she would face his family, and despite having mentally rehearsed the role of perfect wife, her nervousness was almost uncontrollable. His family was famous not only for its economic power, but also for its cold and demanding attitude, an exact reflection of Ethan's personality. And among all the family members, there was one person in particular who caused him apprehension: Ethan's younger sister, Lily Cooper. Ever since Ethan mentioned his sister, Emily had noticed something in the way he talked about her. Lily seemed to be an intelligent young woman, but with a keen sense of distrust and, according to Ethan himself, a natural ability to pick up on unusual details. Furthermore, Lily had a strong bond with her brother, something Emily was still trying to understand. And if there was one person who could put their entire plan at risk, it was her. Emily adjusted her simple but elegant dress, mentally choosing her words and gestures so that everything seemed natural. She knew she would have to impress not only Ethan's sister, but also his parents. People with influence and power used to judging anyone who tried to enter the family's life. There was no room for error. When they arrived, Ethan parked the car in front of the imposing mansion. The house had a classic facade with huge windows and impeccably manicured gardens, which gave the place an aristocratic air. The gates were opened by a security guard, and soon one of the family's employees appeared to welcome them. Before they got out of the car, Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady and cold. "Remember everything we discussed," he whispered as a last instruction. "My family is strict. If they ask about our marriage, keep the story we agreed on. And above all, be yourself, but avoid any details that may seem impulsive." She nodded, swallowing her nervousness. Ethan was still looking at her, and for a moment, Emily saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. It was rare to see him express anything other than his usual calm and rationality, and his sudden vulnerability made her want to make it work, not just for the contract, but for him. When they entered the mansion, they were greeted by Ethan's mother, Margaret Cooper, an elegant woman with an aristocratic bearing and an expression that conveyed firmness. Margaret had perfectly groomed gray hair and wore a sophisticated dress, which contrasted with the controlled smile she wore when she saw the couple. She hugged her son lightly and then turned to Emily, analyzing her for a few seconds. "Ah, so you're Emily," said Margaret, with a smile that seemed more polite than warm. "I heard a lot about you." Emily smiled, trying to maintain a calm posture despite her mother-in-law's appraising look. "I felt like I was being studied in every detail." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Cooper," Emily replied, with a cordial tone, but trying to sound natural. Margaret just nodded and gestured for them to enter. As soon as they entered the Great Hall, Emily was introduced to Ethan's father, Mr. Robert Cooper, a man with a serious expression and imposing bearing, who greeted her with a firm handshake and a look that seemed to pierce through her. "Welcome, Emily," he said, in a restrained but polite tone. "We hope you enjoyed dinner with your family." Emily nodded and smiled in gratitude, but the rigid atmosphere between them made her even more nervous. The pressure of looking the part for her demanding parents was starting to take a toll on her. "I tried to maintain my composure, but I felt that every word and gesture was carefully analyzed by everyone." That was when Emily finally saw Lily, sitting in one of the armchairs next to the fireplace. She watched Emily with a look that mixed curiosity and suspicion. Lily was young, about 5 years younger than Ethan, and classically beautiful, with long dark hair and watchful eyes. She looked much more casual than her parents, wearing a simple blouse and jeans, but her smile was sly, almost mischievous. Lily stood up and walked over, a wry smile on her lips. "Welcome to the family, Emily," she said, extending her hand with a look that seemed to say she didn't believe a word of what was happening. "I confess it was a surprise when Ethan told us about you. He was never one to do anything impulsive." Emily took a deep breath and squeezed her hand, feeling the slight pressure of tension. He knew that sentence had been a disguised test, a way for Lily to probe his reaction. "Well, I guess love always takes us by surprise, doesn't it?" Emily replied with a confident smile. "And sometimes the unexpected is what makes us see things with different eyes." Lily's smile didn't disappear, but her eyes narrowed as if she was determined to test Emily once again. She turned to Ethan and gave him an amused look. "So Ethan, have you finally found someone who can handle your pinpoint accuracy routine? I imagined this to be impossible." Ethan gave a restrained smile, but gave his sister a warning look. "I think you underestimate my ability to adapt, Lily," he replied, with a calm tone. Lily kept her smile, but the look in her eyes made it clear that she didn't buy the sudden love story. Emily realized for the first time how challenging that night would be. Ethan's family was full of formalities and rules, and any mistake on his part could jeopardize the contract he had signed. The dinner felt like a test trap in disguise, and she knew Ethan's sister wouldn't miss the chance to test her on every detail. They were led to the dining room, where a luxurious table was set with fine china, crystal glasses and candles that added a sophisticated touch to the room. Emily was positioned next to Ethan, while Lily, on the other side of the table, kept her eyes trained on her. During the entrance, Margaret began a formal conversation, asking Emily about her career as a fashion designer. Emily responded enthusiastically, explaining her interest in sustainable fabrics and conscious fashion, trying to appear authentic but restrained. Margaret listened attentively, but Emily noticed that Lily had a skeptical expression, as if her every word was a piece of a puzzle that Ethan's sister was trying to decipher. When the conversation turned to the topic of marriage, Robert, Ethan's father, paused meaningfully and looked at his son. "Ethan, it's still surprising that you got married in such a discreet way. I imagined that when you finally decided to get married, there would be a big event." Ethan kept his gaze firmly on his father, but before he could respond, Emily interrupted him with a calm smile. "The wedding was something special for us, Mr. Cooper. An intimate moment, just ours," she replied, looking at Ethan. "Sometimes the best memories don't need big ceremonies. They just need to be true." Ethan's face softened for a moment, and he nodded, as if he agreed with her. Lily raised her eyebrows in surprise, but said nothing. She looked like she wanted to say something, but held back, watching intently. The night continued, and Lily threw a few more provocative questions about Emily and Ethan's love story, trying to find any inconsistencies. Emily responded to each of them calmly, even though she felt the weight of each look of distrust. Lily mentioned a childhood trip where Ethan had injured himself climbing a tree, and to Emily it was clear that this was an attempt to probe whether she really knew details of Ethan's life. It was obvious that she didn't know, but she tried to get around the situation, subtly diverting the conversation and responding with a comment about how determined and persistent Ethan was in everything he did. At the end of the night, back in the car, Ethan drove in silence. After the intense minutes of tension and attempts to maintain the charade, Emily was exhausted. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, a slight note of appreciation in his voice. "You were convincing." He knew how to deal well with Lily. Emily breathed a sigh of relief, but didn't stop smiling with a touch of irony. "Your sister is sharp. It won't be easy to convince her. She's already suspicious, and to be honest, I would be too. She won't stop testing me." He nodded, seeming to accept it as an inevitable fact. "She will watch you all the time, and I know you're smart enough to suspect our story. But if you keep handling it like you did today, we have a chance to convince you." Emily looked at him, exhausted but pleased to know that, at least for that night, she had managed to keep up the facade. "However, I knew that would be just the beginning." Lily was not a threat to be intimidated, and dealing with her would not be easy. After dinner at the Cooper's house, Ethan and Emily continued with their agreed routine. They would appear together at events and act like a newlywed couple at social engagements. Emily gradually became a familiar figure in Ethan's circle of colleagues and business partners, a kind and sympathetic wife that everyone came to recognize. She noticed how he maintained an impeccable and controlled facade, and strove to live up to the role with ease, despite the growing weight of that contract that hung like a secret they both kept. As Emily interacted with Ethan's professional circle, her presence began to shine. Social gatherings and gala events became more than just a demonstration of a fake relationship for her. Emily found opportunities there to connect with fashion professionals and seek out contacts that she would otherwise not have had access to. Quickly, she began to fit in, her charisma and naturalness attracting the attention of influential people. What was a simple formality for Ethan began to become a chance for her to expand her horizons. The contract required her to appear alongside him at these events, and Ethan, practical as ever, figured any interaction she had with other people would be insignificant. But what he didn't expect was that the way Emily stood out would bother him, and as the weeks passed, he began to feel a vague, persistent irritation, especially when he saw how well she got along with her colleagues. One night, they went to a cocktail party hosted by one of Cooper Holdings' longtime investors, Charles Hayes. The event brought together executives, business people, and even media personalities, all eager to discuss business and showcase their achievements. Ethan, as usual, was ready to deal with the night objectively. He greeted Hayes, a middle-aged man with a relaxed air and who had always shown sympathy for him. Emily accompanied him, staying by Ethan's side, but was soon approached by a group of women who were interested in her career as a fashion designer. Emily, taking advantage of the curiosity of her new acquaintances, began to talk about her passion for fashion, explaining the sustainable values that guided her brand. Soon, she became the center of attention of that group, and the people around her were visibly impressed by her creative vision and captivating attitude. Ethan watched from afar, partially listening to her conversation while interacting with other executives. However, the way Emily easily got along with everyone distracted him more than he would have liked. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself, but he couldn't help but feel uncomfortable with the fact that she was gaining popularity among her peers. After a few minutes, a man named Adam Wright, one of the partners in the company that had invested in Cooper Holdings, approached Emily with a casual smile, offering her a drink. Adam had a friendly air and was famous for his charisma. He started asking questions about her work and, after a few comments, praised her sense of style. "I must say, Emily, you are a breath of fresh air." And her vision of sustainability for fashion is exactly what we need. "Don't get me wrong, but I don't see Ethan as having that kind of sensitivity. You complement each other very well," commented Adam, casting a playful look at Ethan. Emily laughed lightly, not noticing the look of discomfort on Ethan's face as he tried to hide his growing irritation. Adam continued the conversation with her, increasingly interested in the ideas she shared, even asking about the possibility of collaborating on sustainable projects. Ethan, observing everything, noticed that an uneasiness was settling in his chest. Something about the easy way she communicated with Adam made him uncomfortable, but he chose to ignore that thought, attributing it to the need to stay focused on the goals of the contract. When they finally left the event, Ethan found himself overcome by a wave of heavy silence as he drove back to the apartment. Emily seemed distracted, mentally reviewing the possibilities that these new connections could bring to her career, but was oblivious to the tension emanating from Ethan next door. He kept his gaze fixed on the road, his expression rigid. After a few minutes of silence, Ethan could no longer contain his discomfort and finally broke the silence. "It looks like you had a lot of fun today," he said, in a slightly cold tone. Emily, a little surprised, looked at him, noticing the strange tone in his voice. "Yes, it was great to meet more people in your circle," she replied, sincerely. "They are all very receptive, and some of the women were very interested in my brand. That's a very good thing for me, don't you think?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road, trying to organize his thoughts. He knew there was no point in bothering about how well she was getting along with her classmates, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "Of course, it's good, but remember, we are there for another reason. Our presence is about the image we are trying to create," he said, his voice still restrained. She frowned, feeling that there was something more to his words. "I'm aware of that, Ethan, but I can't just ignore the opportunities that arise," she replied, with a slight defensive tone. "I have worked so hard to gain recognition in the fashion industry. If these events can help me with that, why not take advantage?" He sighed, trying to maintain control. "I just want you not to lose focus on why we're doing this. We're not here for you to make friends or network, Emily. It's a professional agreement, and when you spend too much time with people like Adam Wright, you seem careless." The direct mention of Adam made Emily silence for a moment. She knew that Ethan was a pragmatic man, but she felt that something more was behind that critical tone. "Are you insinuating that I am acting inappropriately?" she asked, her voice firmer, feeling slightly offended. Ethan glanced quickly at her before turning his attention back to the road. "I'm not insinuating anything. I just want you to remember the conditions of the contract. The priority is to maintain a consistent image and not socialize excessively." She crossed her arms, uncomfortable with what seemed like unfair criticism. During all those events, she had done everything agreed upon, acting as the devoted and interested wife he needed on his side. But his words made her wonder if she was really being valued for all her effort. "If being the perfect wife means that I must remain isolated, Perhaps I should have specified that in the contract, she countered, feeling her frustration growing. Because until now, I have followed each of the rules we agreed on. Ethan remained silent, visibly uncomfortable. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but he held back, as if he knew that any response could intensify the conflict. After a few more minutes of tense silence, they arrived at the apartment. They both got out of the car without exchanging a word, and the cold atmosphere between them continued as they went up the elevator. As soon as they entered the apartment, Ethan took off his coat and turned to her, his face finally revealing a mix of tiredness and frustration. "You're right," he said, with a sigh, as if that were difficult to admit. "It's not fair to ask you to ignore opportunities. I know how much this means to you." Emily, still surprised by his irritation, crossed her arms and looked at him, as if expecting a more sincere explanation. She knew there was more to it than just public image. Something in Ethan's actions indicated that he was being affected in a way that even he didn't seem to understand. "Ethan, if this contract is starting to weigh you down, maybe we should talk about what we each really want from this," she suggested, with a softer tone. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes conveying a mix of emotions he kept hidden most of the time. "That's what I want," he said, his voice low but determined. "What we are doing now, this partnership, is what I need to complete certain commitments. But I admit that." He hesitated, as if fighting against what he wanted to say. "I admit that I'm getting used to this in a way I didn't expect. Sometimes I forget it's just a contract." Emily felt her heart beat faster upon hearing that confession. For the first time, he made it clear that this was not just a calculated strategy. Behind the contract, the facade, and the conditions, there was something more, something he couldn't control. She realized that perhaps Ethan was starting to blur the fine line between their professional agreement and the bond they had built over the weeks. With a slight smile, she approached him, trying to ease the tension that still hung in the air. "I don't think it's a problem to get used to it," she said, softly, almost like a whisper. "I just think you need to learn that you can't control everything all the time." He returned the smile with a calmer expression, as if he had finally found some relief from that restlessness. And for the first time since the beginning of the contract, they exchanged a look that conveyed mutual understanding. There, between the unspoken words and the shared silences, they both realized that the contract was beginning to crack, giving way to something that neither of them could have predicted. That morning, Emily was completely focused on the fashion show she had been organizing for weeks. This event represented a crucial opportunity to launch her new collection and attract investors to her sustainable clothing brand. Emily knew she was faced with a unique chance to showcase her work to a wider audience and secure the visibility she had always craved. It was the kind of event that could change your career forever, and the nervousness only increased as the time approached. Ethan, as usual, had left the apartment early and had given no indication that he would be attending the parade. In a way, she even preferred it that way. Events with him were always complicated, full of expectations of behavior that was consistent with the contract. Furthermore, in recent days, the tension between the two had become more evident. Small disagreements and exchanges of barbs began to show that relationship, however calculated it was exerting silent pressure on both of them. The prospect of performing alone, without Ethan's constant surveillance, was almost a source of relief to her. Emily arrived at the event location a few hours before the start to ensure everything was perfectly organized. The room was elegant, with a lit stage and chairs arranged around the catwalk in an intimate setting. The models were already in the dressing room, trying on the costumes, and Emily went from one to another, checking every detail with an attentive eye. He was demanding and perfectionist when it came to his work, a curious contrast to his laid-back personality in his personal life. However, the pressure of making everything go exactly as she had planned was starting to take a toll. The minutes seemed to be running against her as typical last-minute problems arose. A dress whose hem was wrong, a late model, and even a problem with the catwalk lighting. Everything seemed to pile up at once, and no matter how much she tried to stay calm, the stress was about to overwhelm her. She barely had time to breathe when she heard steady footsteps behind her. And when she turned, she found Ethan standing there, dressed impeccably but with a relaxed, confident expression that surprised her. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" he asked with wide eyes, his voice showing shock. He gave a restrained smile, which mixed a light expression of humor with the tranquility she wasn't used to seeing. "I came to see your parade," he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I thought you might need some support." Emily remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing his presence there. Although she had spent time with Ethan on a daily basis, she had never imagined that he would be interested enough to participate in something so important to her. Over time, he had always demonstrated an almost absolute focus on his own business, and for her, being there meant that he saw the event as something truly significant. Before she could say thank you, one of the production assistants called her, informing her that one of the VIP guests had arrived earlier than expected. Emily gave Ethan a desperate look, knowing she was about to lose control of the situation. He realized what was happening and without hesitation, took a practical stance. "Go take care of the guests, Emily. I can solve the other problems," he said firmly. She looked at him hesitantly, not believing he was actually willing to help. But without any more time to question him, he nodded and went on to welcome the guest. While dealing with the situation, she looked back every now and then, hoping that Ethan would lose interest and leave the place. But, to her surprise, he was still there, organizing everything with a methodical calm, as if that type of event was natural to him. Not only did Ethan help with the technical issues and organization, but he also mentored some of the assistants who seemed as lost as she was. He even got involved in adjusting the spotlights and coordinating the sound, his precise and clear instructions helping to resolve any last-minute setbacks. He seemed to be in his element, and Emily, seeing him like this, felt an unexpected admiration rise in her chest. As the parade approached, Emily realized that with Ethan's help, everything was finally in order. The hall was filled with guests and journalists, all eager to see the collection. When the first model walked onto the runway, Emily sighed with relief, realizing that the event was going exactly as planned, perhaps even better than she could have imagined. Ethan, watching the parade beside her, maintained a serious expression, but there was a gleam in his eyes that she had never seen before. He looked at her creations as if truly impressed, every detail seeming to captivate him in a genuine way. For Emily, it was strange to see that spark of enthusiasm in him. "I had never thought that Ethan was someone who appreciated fashion, especially a sustainable clothing line like hers." After the show, guests gathered for cocktails, and Emily was greeted by several business people and designers who praised the originality of the collection. Ethan remained by her side throughout the reception, a supportive presence that made her feel more confident. At one point, while talking to an interested investor, she found herself watching him sideways. The way he interacted with people, even without being the focus of the night, conveyed an aura of tranquility and security. She began to realize that he was there not just as a husband figure, but as someone who genuinely wanted her to succeed that night. Finally, as the event drew to a close and the guests began to say goodbye, Emily pulled him to a more private corner, away from the hustle and bustle of the room. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, in a soft tone, but full of gratitude. "I wouldn't have managed it without your help. Seriously, this whole thing would have fallen apart if you weren't here." Ethan looked at her, and the slight smile he gave seemed sincere, almost vulnerable. It was an expression he rarely let on, and something in his gaze completely disarmed her. "You did an incredible job, Emily. I just helped with the details," he replied, keeping his tone low. She laughed, shaking her head. "Did I help with the details? Ethan, you practically saved the event." I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He laughed too, and for once the sound was genuine and relaxed. It was almost strange to see him like this, genuinely laughing without the imperturbable CEO mask he usually wore. Emily noticed how his expression changed in that moment, as if he was dropping the meticulous facade he usually used as a shield. And as she watched him, she felt something stir inside her, an unexpected connection that made her realize he was so much more than the rigid man she knew. For a few seconds, they were silent, just looking at each other. The closeness between the two was palpable, and Emily realized that, for the first time, there was nothing artificial about their relationship. It wasn't the contract that kept them there, nor the need to maintain an appearance for the public. It was simply him and her, sharing a true moment. "You know, I really admired what you did with this collection," he said, breaking the silence. "It's the kind of sight you don't see often. You have talent, Emily, and it's clear you're heading in the right direction." Those words made her heart beat faster. It wasn't the kind of compliment one would expect from a hired husband. It was genuine, and the sincerity in his eyes showed that he truly believed what he was saying. Emily smiled, feeling emotional in a way she had never imagined possible with Ethan. "Thank you," she said, softly, almost like a whisper. Without realizing it, she reached out and touched his arm, a spontaneous gesture that not even she herself understood. That touch was simple, but loaded with meaning, and Ethan didn't back down. On the contrary, he seemed to absorb the gesture with a surprising intensity, and his eyes remained fixed on hers, as if he were trying to decipher her every thought at that moment. "You deserve this, Emily. She deserves this success," he added, his voice low, as if it were a secret that only she could hear. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. They were both there, so close that they could hear each other breathing. Emily smelled Ethan's soft scent, and the heat emanating from him created a mix of security and attraction that she couldn't control. Something new had emerged between them, something that transcended the contract and all the formalities that surrounded them. Finally, Ethan looked away, as if something made him step back before that moment became something he couldn't control. He took a step back, breaking the closeness they had shared, but not without leaving a feeling of something unfinished in the air. "I think we'd better go," he said, trying to regain his practical tone. "Tomorrow you will have to deal with the results of this success, and you will need to be rested for that." Emily nodded, still feeling the weight of that moment between them. The tension and connection that arose there was too strong to ignore, and she knew that from that moment on, something had changed for both of them. On the way back to the apartment, the silence between them was deep and charged. She knew that that silence said more than any words, and at the same time, it was as if they both feared breaking that stillness and ruining what had been shared. When they arrived, Emily got ready to go to her room, and Ethan said goodbye with a slight wave, heading to the office. However, before he disappeared through the door, she called out to him, "Ethan?" He turned around, and his expression looked unsure, almost as if he was also dealing with his own confused feelings. "Trying?" She hesitated, feeling the urge to thank him again, but the words didn't come. All that remained was the deep look they shared, a silent understanding that something had changed between them that night. Instead of saying anything, she just smiled, and he returned it with an equally restrained smile, but one that revealed enough. And then, with nothing more to be said, he left, leaving her alone with a whirlwind of new and unexpected emotions. Emily still relived in her mind the parade that had marked her career, and especially Ethan's unexpected presence there, helping her, supporting her, and acting in a way she would never have imagined. Since that night, a new kind of tension seemed to exist between them. She noticed looks that he avoided sustaining, strange pauses in everyday conversations, and, above all, a kind of reserve in his interactions. It was as if they had gotten too close, and without him saying a word about it, she felt that Ethan was trying to pull away again, to return to the rigidity of the contract. The feeling of an invisible barrier was beginning to bother her, but she tried to ignore it, concentrating on her work. A few days after the fashion show, Emily was surprised by a message from an old friend, Daniel Lin. Daniel was a photographer and worked for an independent fashion magazine that was gaining more and more space in the Los Angeles scene. He and Emily had a long friendship, and he had supported her from the beginning of her journey into the fashion world. Upon learning of her success at the show, Daniel invited her to launch his own photography exhibition, where he would portray influential figures in fashion and sustainable design. A perfect connection to Emily's work. She accepted the invitation with enthusiasm. Since moving into Ethan's apartment, her social interactions had become more controlled and limited, mostly restricted to events involving his company or the couple's married image. The prospect of meeting Daniel and participating in something that was directly linked to her passion and personal journey made her excited. During breakfast, she decided to tell Ethan about the event, trying to make it sound casual, but his reaction surprised her. "Are you going to find Daniel?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, but his voice sounded slightly strained. Emily, who until then hadn't noticed the intensity in his gaze, nodded as she stirred her coffee with a smile. "Yes. He is going to open a photographic exhibition on sustainable fashion. I thought it would be interesting and that it could even bring me more visibility in the industry." Ethan remained silent for a moment, clutching the cup between his hands and giving her a look that mixed displeasure and uncertainty. "I know he's an old friend of yours, but do you think it's appropriate to go to this event?" he asked, in a controlled voice but filled with a certain irritation that Emily was still trying to understand. She frowned, surprised by the question. "Why wouldn't it be appropriate?" he replied, lifting his chin in defiance. "Daniel is an important friend to me, someone who supported me at times when I was starting out. And on top of that, he's an incredible professional." Ethan let out a soft sigh and looked away, as if trying to contain his growing irritation. "Of course you want to honor a friend's work. I just don't know if this is coherent with the type of image we are building," he said, each word carefully selected, but still showing discomfort. Emily stared at him, feeling torn between anger and bewilderment. It was the first time she had seen Ethan act possessive, and it bothered her more than she expected. She crossed her arms, looking at him. "Ethan, we are building a professional image, not a prison," he replied, firmly. "I have the right to maintain friendships and get involved with other professionals." He stared at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He seemed to want to respond, but hesitated. And in that brief moment, Emily saw something different in his eyes. Maybe it was a hint of jealousy, or perhaps an insecurity that he was trying to hide beneath the veneer of indifference. "I just think we need to think about the impact that this type of exit could have on our relationship," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper, but still filled with a frustration that he seemed unable to control. Emily took a deep breath, and the silence stretched between them, charged and uncomfortable. She knew there was something more behind Ethan's concern, something he wasn't willing to admit. And as she tried to deal with that growing discomfort, she decided that she wouldn't allow him to restrict her. On the night of the event, Emily dressed carefully, choosing an elegant black dress and a pair of simple but striking earrings that Daniel had given her years ago as a thank you for partnering on a photography project. When he left the room, he found Ethan in the living room with an impenetrable expression, but one that revealed a subtle discomfort. "So, you really will," he said, as he watched her with a fixed gaze that seemed to pierce through her. She nodded, keeping her tone casual. "Yes, and I'll be back before you know it." Before he could respond, she left, feeling his gaze fixed on her back, like a mixture of disapproval and something she couldn't completely identify. As she walked toward the taxi, her heart pounded, and a part of her questioned whether she really should have been so blunt. But remembering Ethan's possessive expression, he decided that this was a moment when he needed to assert his own freedom. At the event, Emily met Daniel and was welcomed with a warm hug. They spent the evening talking about art and fashion, remembering moments from the past and talking about their future ambitions. Daniel was fun, full of life, and had a light sense of humor, characteristics that contrasted drastically with Ethan's meticulous profile. Daniel's naturalness was something she had always appreciated, and that, in a way, made her feel more comfortable in her own skin. They laughed, they drank, and for a few moments, she felt free from the tensions that the contract and life with Ethan imposed. When he returned to the apartment, close to midnight, he found Ethan sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey in his hands and a closed expression. He stood up as soon as she entered, and the silence between them was thick and uncomfortable. Emily noticed the look of disapproval on his face and knew, before he even spoke, that they were about to have the argument she had tried so hard to avoid. "Did you have fun?" he asked, his voice low, but full of sarcasm that made her eyebrows arch. Emily felt irritation rise within her. It wasn't just a question, it was a trial. "Yes, I had fun," he replied, firmly. "I don't see a problem with that." Ethan let out a short but humorless laugh as he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Funny how you say that as if it were trivial. But I think you forgot that we have an appointment, Emily. And that commitment includes certain considerations." She crossed her arms, indignant at the insinuation. "Commitment? We're in a contract, Ethan," she replied, her voice louder than she intended. "You don't own me, and this contract doesn't give you the right to control my life, much less my friendships." He stared at her, his expression hardening even more. "I'm not trying to control your life, but I thought you'd understand that certain choices are inconvenient given what we're pretending to be." Emily took a step back, feeling the intensity of his words. It was clear that the idea of his friendship with Daniel bothered him deeply, but the reason remained hidden as something he didn't want to acknowledge. And then, on an impulse that she herself didn't understand, she decided to confront him once and for all. "Why does this bother you so much?" she asked, looking at him. "What's really going on here, Ethan?" He looked away, but the tension on his face was evident. She noticed that he was struggling with himself, as if he was trying to maintain the rationality that had always come naturally to him. But he could no longer hold on to that mask. "Do you really want to know?" he replied, his voice lower, almost a whisper. She nodded, and he finally looked into her eyes, as if he were about to reveal something he had been suppressing for a long time. "Because I don't like the idea of you with him, Emily. I don't like the way he looks at you, the way he talks to you, and most of all, I don't like how happy you seem around him." His words fell like an unexpected confession. Emily was silent, absorbing what he had just said. It was as if finally, the truth was before them, without any filter or disguise. Ethan, the man who had always been a fortress of self-control, was confessing something that went far beyond what either of them had planned for this contract. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice low but full of emotion. "Are you jealous, Ethan?" He looked away, as if the question were too difficult to answer, but his silence was enough for her to understand. They were beyond the limit of the contract, beyond what either of them could control. And in that moment, Emily realized that what she felt for Ethan was something she wasn't willing to ignore either. Without another word, she approached him, and they both stood there, still, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. The tension between them was palpable, and although neither knew what would come next, they knew something fundamental had changed forever. The party was in full swing, with the room full of executives, business people, and industry influencers. The atmosphere was luxurious and lit with soft lights, which gave an almost golden glow to the glasses of champagne and the calculated smiles that crossed the room. Ethan and Emily had arrived together, as usual, maintaining the perfect appearance of the couple in love that society expected to see. Both wore impeccable clothes. Ethan was in an elegant tuxedo, and Emily in a long red silk dress, which accentuated her figure in a sophisticated way, attracting discreet and admiring glances wherever she went. During the first hours of the event, they circulated around the hall, greeting partners and discussing business. Emily noticed that people were increasingly comfortable with her presence at Ethan's side, as if her image as a devoted wife was finally gaining credibility. Ethan, on the other hand, maintained his usual impeccable and discreet posture, but every now and then, she felt his gaze falling on her with an intensity that left her tense. It was a look that he no longer seemed able to hide, and that made her question how far he could really separate the contract from reality. At one point in the evening, after several formal meetings and conversations, Ethan was called in for a conversation with one of Cooper Holdings' main investors. Emily was alone for a few minutes, taking the opportunity to drink a glass of champagne and observe the people around her. She was distracted, lost in thought, when she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. When she turned around, she found Ethan back, looking at her closely, and she noticed that there was something different about him. "Are you well?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her eyes. Emily nodded, but felt her heart beat faster at the unexpected closeness. "Yes, just thinking," she replied, trying to keep her tone casual. He smiled slightly, but the expression in his eyes didn't match the smile. It seemed like there was a mixture of emotions hidden there, as if he was evaluating her every reaction, looking for something that he himself might not know how to define. "Tonight is different," he murmured, his voice low. Emily looked at him in surprise and felt like it was more of a confession than a casual comment. She knew that, despite all the facade of practicality, something was changing between them, something that became more and more evident with each exchange of glances each touch and each moment shared in silence. At that moment, soft music began to play, filling the room. Many of the guests began dancing, and before she could think, Ethan reached out his hand to her. "Do you want to dance?" Emily hesitated, but the intensity in his gaze made her accept it. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the center of the room, where other couples were already moving in harmony. As soon as he pulled her close, she felt the heat of his body against hers, and for an instant, the world around her seemed to disappear. There was no more contract, party, or other people's eyes. Just them, dancing to music that echoed softly in the room. As they danced, Emily noticed Ethan's face getting closer, and her heart beat faster and faster. His hand was on your waist, firm, and his touch was both protective and enveloping, as if he wanted to keep you there forever. The tension between them was palpable, growing with each step, and she felt his gaze fixed on her lips, as if he were considering breaking all the barriers that separated them. Ethan took a deep breath, as if fighting to maintain control, but he didn't back down. Their faces were so close that Emily could feel his breath, slow and warm, intertwining with hers. And then, without either of them saying a word, he kissed her. It was an unexpected, intense kiss, which carried all the emotions and tensions repressed in recent weeks. The touch of his lips was gentle at first, but soon became deeper, as if he had finally surrendered to what he had tried to hide. Emily felt invaded by a whirlwind of feelings, a mixture of desire and surprise, which made her forget everything around her. She couldn't think, she just felt it. The touch of his hands on her back, the firmness with which he held her, and the way that kiss seemed to last an eternity. When they separated, they were both panting, and Ethan's gaze reflected the same confusion and intensity that she felt. For a moment, they remained silent, still very close, as if any word could break the magic of that moment. "Emily," he began, his voice low and hoarse. She looked at him, her eyes still shining with surprise and excitement. She didn't know what to say, but a feeling of vulnerability enveloped them, and she realized they were both equally confused. What did that kiss mean? Was it just part of the facade they had created? Or was it a sign of something deeper, something they had both ignored until that moment? Before she could respond or reflect on what had just happened, one of the company's executives approached them, interrupting the moment with a question directed at Ethan. He quickly regained his composure, adopting the professional stance that always characterized him. But when he took one last look at her, she saw the intensity still present, an unspoken promise, as if that moment couldn't simply be set aside. Emily spent the remainder of the evening in a state of confusion, unable to concentrate on any conversation or greet other guests without her thoughts returning to what had happened. Ethan's kiss hadn't been a part of the contract. It was a rupture in the barrier carefully erected between them, something as unexpected as it was intense, that changed everything she thought about that relationship. And at the same time, the vulnerability she saw in him made her question how far he was willing to let this relationship go. When the party finally came to an end, Emily couldn't wait to get to the apartment to process everything that had happened. On the way back, the silence between her and Ethan was thick, filled with tension and all the words that were stuck between them. He drove with a serious expression, his gaze fixed on the road, but she knew he was also reliving every second of that kiss. When they arrived at the apartment, Emily hesitated at the door before entering. There was an invisible barrier between them, but now, unlike what she felt before, she didn't want it to be restored. Ethan looked equally uneasy, and after a long silence, he turned to her, his gaze full of unspoken questions. About what happened, he began, but soon interrupted, seeming to fight against his own emotions. Emily took a deep breath, knowing that this was the time to be honest, to face what she was feeling. "I don't know what that means either, Ethan," he confessed, his voice low but sincere. "All I know is that it wasn't an act. Not for me." He looked at her, surprised by her sincerity, and something softened in his expression. The silence between them seemed filled with everything they were trying to say without words. And then, without another word, he came closer again, taking her hands in his eyes fixed on hers. "I can't pretend this is just a contract," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "This, between us, I can no longer pretend that it's just a formality." His words were a relief to Emily, but they also left her vulnerable, exposed to a reality that, until then, she had tried to avoid. They were crossing a dangerous line, but at the same time, I knew that it was a truth that neither of them could ignore anymore. Still, uncertainty overwhelmed her, and she felt the need to understand how far he was willing to go. "Ethan, if it's not a formality, then what is it?" she asked, hesitant, but determined to get an answer. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race, as if he too was trying to understand the depth of his own feelings. "I still don't know for sure," he admitted, his gaze soft and serious at the same time. "But I know I want to find out, and I want you to be part of it." Emily felt a wave of emotions overcome her, and before she could hesitate or question, she pulled him closer and kissed him again, sealing what they had both tried to deny for so long. This second kiss was softer, but equally full of promise and emotions they couldn't yet name. It was as if, finally, they were both ready to face everything this relationship would bring, regardless of what the contract stipulated. The kiss was interrupted only by the need to breathe, but this time, the silence between them was complicity, and Ethan's gaze showed a softness and vulnerability that she had never seen. They didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, they were ready to find out together. The days that followed the unexpected kiss were tense and filled with increasing restlessness. Emily woke up every morning thinking about that intense moment between her and Ethan, reliving the closeness, the warmth, and his words that seemed to finally show how he felt. But, to her surprise and disappointment, Ethan seemed determined to put an almost cold distance between them since that night. The morning after the kiss, he left the apartment early, without even waiting for her for breakfast as he normally did. And upon returning home at night, he limited himself to a quick and formal greeting, diving into his office and remaining there until late. Emily felt the weight of his behavior and wondered if he was sorry or just trying to maintain control. As the days went by, she noticed that this distance only increased, as if he was returning to the role of the controlled CEO, limiting his interactions to the essential and avoiding any time alone with her. The first time they tried to have dinner together after that night, Ethan was so quiet that Emily almost couldn't believe he was the same man who had held her in his arms and confessed how confused he was about his own feelings. Now he was there, sitting in front of her, cutting her food with exact movements, avoiding looking at her, and asking trivial questions about the progress of her work as if nothing had changed. She pretended not to care, refusing to confront him about what was clearly happening. But with each silence, with each evasion, she felt a pang of hurt that grew day by day. That indifference made her question everything she had felt up until then, and even whether the kiss had been as real for him as it had been for her. On a sunny morning, weeks after the kiss, Emily received a call from an important contact she had met at the show, inviting her to a meeting that could lead to a new partnership for her brand. She accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, but when telling Ethan the news, she expected at least a hint of support, something that could show that he was at least happy for her. But his response was so impersonal that it hurt her deeply. "Congratulations, Emily," he said, in a tone that sounded polite, but without any enthusiasm. "I hope the meeting is productive." She expected more, some demonstration of joy, some sincere reaction like the one he had on the day of the parade, when he had supported her and helped her overcome her challenges. But instead, he looked back at his laptop screen, ending the conversation with a nod, as if she were any co-worker and not the woman with whom he had shared confidences and a passionate kiss. Emily spent the rest of the day in a spiral of thoughts, trying to understand what he was feeling. "I tried to rationalize, thinking that maybe he was scared by the intensity of what he felt, or even confused by the direction the relationship was taking. But the lack of dialogue tortured her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was deliberately blocking any chance of real connection between them." That night, alone in her room, Emily wondered if there was something wrong with her for having let herself get so caught up in something that, in his eyes, was apparently nothing more than a momentary slip. The way he had dove back into his comfort zone and hidden behind the cold facade of the contract only made it clear that he wasn't willing to fight for anything that got out of control. She wished she had the courage to confront him, to say everything she was feeling, but pride and fear of appearing vulnerable held her back. Over the weeks, the tension between them became increasingly visible. Ethan continued to avoid her whenever he could, arriving late and immersing himself in work, as if he was hiding behind his obligations so as not to face what was happening. And Emily, in turn, started going out more and more, trying to distract herself with the networking opportunities that were emerging in her career and trying, uselessly, to fill the void she felt. But no matter how much she tried to pretend that everything was fine, the heartache consumed her. In the rare moments when Ethan was home and the two were alone, the silence between them was almost unbearable, like an invisible wall that prevented them from even exchanging a sincere look. She refused to show any sign of fragility, avoiding questioning him about his indifference. If he wanted to walk away, then she would pretend she didn't care, no matter how much it destroyed her inside. One night, during one of the few times they had dinner together, the situation came to a head. Emily was trying to engage in casual conversation about upcoming fashion events, telling her about an exhibition she had been invited to. She spoke enthusiastically, trying to share even a fraction of her joy with him. But Ethan seemed oblivious, responding in monosyllables and looking away whenever she tried to get closer in any way. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, she set down the cutlery with a dry movement and faced him. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Why are you suddenly acting as if I don't exist?" He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely disconcerted. That vulnerable look appeared briefly, but was soon replaced by the mask of indifference he had been wearing. I don't know what you're talking about, Emily," he replied, trying to sound casual. "We have our obligations, and I'm just fulfilling my part of the agreement." She looked at him in disbelief, feeling a sharp pain when she heard those words. So many weeks of closeness, of shared moments, and all he could say was that he was fulfilling the agreement. That was the final straw. And even because, the way I see it, you are fulfilling the agreement so well that you barely seem to remember that we are living together, she replied, with an acid tone that she herself did not expect. He remained silent, unable to find the words to respond, and Emily realized that any attempt to get closer to him would be futile. His expression was that of someone who was in an internal struggle, but he didn't allow anything to show. Tired of the situation, she stood up, feeling her eyes water, but refusing to let him see any sign of weakness. "You know, Ethan," she continued, her voice shaking, "maybe I was a fool to think that this could be more than a contract." Ethan watched her, his expression subdued, but something in his eyes made her hesitate for a second. There was a spark of pain there, a split second where he seemed like he was about to say something, but his resistance was stronger. With a sinking heart, Emily turned and left the room without looking back, keeping her posture straight and refusing to let herself fall. In the following days, the distance between them only intensified. Emily immersed herself in her work and new professional opportunities, trying to occupy every free minute so as not to think about the coldness that Ethan demonstrated. As much as she tried to deceive herself, she knew she missed him, the closeness they had shared before everything fell apart. She longed for an honest conversation, but was afraid of opening up again and hurting herself even more. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed increasingly withdrawn into his world, acting as if nothing but work mattered. He had built a wall around himself, and Emily knew that as long as he maintained that blockage, there would be no way through it. One night, Emily was in the apartment alone, reviewing some sketches for her new collection. She had finally managed to schedule an important meeting with an investor interested in her sustainable fashion line. And it was the kind of achievement that would normally leave her elated. But the happiness felt empty, and her mind kept returning to Ethan, to the unspoken words, to the open wounds. When he arrived late at night, she noticed that he glanced at her, as if trying to decipher her emotions, but then quickly looked away. It was evident that he was also tired of the situation, but his obstinacy in remaining distant seemed unbreakable. Finally, after a long silence, Emily raised her head and decided to try one more time, trying to approach the situation without confronting him directly. "Ethan," she began, in a softer tone, "I know we have an agreement, but I can't continue living like this. pretending that nothing happened between us. I won't insist if you don't want to, but at least tell me what you really think." He was silent, and for a moment she thought he would open up, but instead, he let out a heavy sigh and shook his head, looking exhausted. "Emily, it's better to keep things as they are," he replied, his voice low, but without emotion. "It's safer for both of us." She felt a deep pain when she heard those words and knew, in that instant, that the distance he insisted on maintaining was more than fear. It was a choice. He had decided for some reason to walk away, and as long as he continued to hide what he really felt, that relationship was doomed to be nothing more than an empty contract. Without responding, she retreated to her room, feeling defeated. She knew she couldn't force him to open up, and as long as he kept that wall around himself, she was left with only the silence of a shared but lonely life. And that night, as she tried to fall asleep, Emily realized that maybe she was getting to the point where she couldn't live like that anymore, always waiting for something that, deep down, he would never be ready to offer. The days passed monotonously and distantly, while Ethan and Emily maintained a cold and superficial routine, as if they had returned to the beginning of the contract, where every word and every look was carefully contained to avoid any real involvement. Emily, although hurt, tried to convince herself that maybe it was better to keep things that way. After all, expecting more from someone like Ethan, who clearly prioritized control and stability, would be foolish. One afternoon, amidst a pile of work, she received an unexpected call from Ethan's sister Lily. The relationship between them had never been entirely friendly. Lily had always treated her with a slight suspicion, as if she felt there was something wrong with the way their relationship had started. But even so, Ethan's sister continued to greet her at family events, maintaining a distant and observant cordiality. So Lily's call took her by surprise. "Emily, I hope you don't mind that I'm calling you directly," Lily began, with her typical tone of controlled calm. "I needed a favor, and I thought you could help me." Emily couldn't hide her surprise. After a brief hesitation, he replied, "Of course, Lily. How can I help?" Lily explained that she was organizing the charity exhibition at an art gallery downtown. There were a lot of preparations to be made, and Lily wanted Emily to help curate the decorative elements. The request sounded unexpected, especially since Lily had never shown much interest in Emily's opinion on such personal matters. However, Emily saw it as a chance to distract herself and, perhaps, to understand more about the environment in which Ethan grew up and the people around him. On the appointed day, she arrived at the gallery and found Lily already busy with the final details of the organization. The gallery was a sophisticated and discreet space, with impeccable white walls that contrasted with the works on display. Pictures of different styles covered the walls, forming a set that, at the same time, seemed chaotic and harmonious. Emily observed the works for a few moments, noticing the expression and feeling that seemed to come out of the canvas, something visceral and full of emotion. She approached Lily, who greeted her with a light smile and began to guide her through the exhibition, explaining the origin of the works and the importance of each one of them to the collection. In the middle of the conversation, Lily took her to a private room, where some of the event's main pieces were on display. As Emily walked through the door, she felt the air change around her, as if there was something special in that space. In the center of the room, there was a series of paintings in dark and deep tones, which captured abstract scenes of landscapes and almost unrecognizable figures, but with an intense emotion which revealed pain and conflict. One of the works in particular caught his attention. It was a black and gray painting, which portrayed a city at night, with shadows that seemed to hide deep secrets. She stood transfixed in front of the painting, absorbing every detail, feeling strangely connected to that vision. Lily, noticing Emily's interest, approached silently. "That's my favorite," she said, in a lower tone, almost like a whisper. "And interestingly, it was painted by Ethan." Emily looked at her, shocked. The idea of Ethan as an artist was almost impossible to conceive. He always seemed so controlled, so practical and logical, that it had never crossed your mind that he might have an artistic side. "Ethan?" whispered Emily, still looking at the painting, as if wanting to understand more about the man behind that talent. "Did he paint this?" I never imagined he was an artist. Lily nodded, and her gaze softened, as if she were about to reveal something she had kept hidden for a long time. My brother always had a special talent for art. Since he was little, he spent hours drawing, painting, creating worlds that only he could see. He was free, you know. There was an intensity about him that made everyone around him believe he would be a great artist one day. But circumstances changed everything. Emily remained silent, absorbing Lily's every word. I felt a mixture of surprise and sadness when I imagined young Ethan, full of passion and dreams, dedicating himself to something so different from what was his reality today. When our father started to get sick, Lily continued with a distant look. He had to take over the family business. It was a difficult decision, but he gave up everything for our father, for our family. And over time, he began to hide behind the facade of a businessman, hiding every part of that artistic side that you are seeing now. Emily looked at the painting again, as if she could suddenly understand the depth of those shadows and the conflict present in each brushstroke. It was as if there, she could see the real Ethan, a man who had once dreamed of being free and who, out of love for his family, had trapped himself in a world that didn't belong to him. She felt a deep sadness for him, but also a new respect that went beyond anything she could have felt before. She now understood the weight he carried, the pressure he put on himself to maintain control and distance, as if the only way to protect himself was through coldness. Everything made sense. The need to move away, the rigidity, the fear of getting involved. I never imagined he carried something like that, Emily muttered, almost to herself. Lily looked at her, assessing her, and gave a small smile that was almost knowing. He doesn't let many people know this side of him, Emily, but somehow I think you've always known there's more to him than meets the eye. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of that revelation. What I felt for Ethan changed every second, and now it was as if an entire layer of him was peeling away. The toughness he demonstrated, the perfectionism, the need to control everything around him. It was all a reflection of a sacrifice made in the name of responsibility. And now, more than ever, she wanted to be by his side, even if he continued to push her away, because she knew that, behind all that shield, he was someone who still held the desire to create, to be vulnerable. When she returned to the apartment that night, Emily found Ethan in the office, absorbed in documents, as always. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him silently as he maintained a rigid posture, his eyes focused on the sheets of paper in front of him. It was as if that space was his refuge, where he tried to control everything, leaving aside any trace of the man she now knew he really was. Determined to break the barrier between them, she entered the office and approached, feeling her heart accelerate as she realized that this moment would be crucial. "Ethan," she called softly. He looked up, surprised by her presence, but his expression soon returned to the reserved expression he used as protection. "Emily, do you need anything?" he asked, his tone polite and distant. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully as she tried to break the ice he insisted on maintaining. "Today, I was with your sister. I went to help organize an art exhibition, and I saw something that surprised me," she said, observing his reaction. Ethan looked away for a moment, and she noticed a slight tremor in his expression. It was evident that he knew what she was talking about, but preferred to avoid it. "I don't see what this has to do with us, Emily," he murmured, his tone cold, but she noticed the tension in his voice. But Emily had no intention of backing down. "I knew this was the moment to show that I understood, to say that he no longer needed to hide that part of himself. It has everything to do with us, Ethan," he insisted, his voice firm but calm. "I saw your paintings. I saw what you left behind to take care of your family. And now, I finally understand you. I understand why you maintain this distance, this control." He looked at her, his eyes surprised, and for a moment he seemed vulnerable, as if someone had discovered the secret he had kept with so much effort. But instead of giving in, he closed his face, as if he wanted to protect himself again. "There is nothing to understand, Emily. That's part of the past," he said, his voice firm, but with a slight tremor that betrayed the facade of indifference. She took a step closer, determined not to give up. "Maybe it's the past, but it's still in you. That part of you, that passion, is still there, Ethan. I saw this in his paintings. You don't need to hide from me, she said, her voice full of emotion. He sighed and looked away, as if trying to hold back the words. For the first time, he seemed to hesitate, and she knew she had touched a wound he had never let anyone see. Finally, he looked at her, and his eyes were filled with suppressed sadness. It's easy to say, Emily, but I can't just take it back. This life is what's left for me. Emily felt a pang of pain when she heard those words, but she also understood that he was trapped in a trap created by his own loyalty and fear. And at that moment, he decided that he would do everything to show him that, even with all his obligations, he could still be who he really was. The days following the revelation about Ethan's artistic past were marked by thick, silent tension in the apartment. Emily carried with her a new perception of him, seeing the man behind the facade of control and perfection. The image she had discovered in his paintings touched her deeply, and she wondered how many times he had fought the desire to drop everything and go back to being who he really was. Now that he knew the passion Ethan had suffocated to take on the family legacy, a new admiration had blossomed, but also anguish. She knew he suffered, even if he would never admit it. Ethan, for his part, seemed even more closed off than before. Upon realizing that Emily knew his secret, he avoided any personal topics, throwing himself even deeper into his work, as if that could erase the vulnerability she had revealed. It was as if he was determined to keep a barrier between them, perhaps fearing how much she might affect him if he let her in one more time. One night, Emily decided she couldn't take the silence any longer. Determined to show Ethan that he didn't have to face this alone, she knocked on his office door. Without waiting for a response, he entered, finding him buried in a pile of documents, with his gaze fixed and distant. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm and low. He looked up, a mix of surprise and resistance crossing his face. He closed the file in front of him, as if he knew he wouldn't be able to avoid this conversation. "Emily, we already talked about this," he replied, trying to keep his tone distant. "I have my life, my responsibilities. That's my role now, and there's nothing to discuss." Emily didn't back down. Instead, she stepped forward, determined to break that armor. "Are you telling me that you have resigned yourself to living a life that does not complete you? A life that suffocates your dreams?" she replied, looking at him intensely. "You can be dedicated to your family, to the company, but that doesn't mean you need to abandon who you really are." Ethan sighed, clearly uncomfortable. He looked away, his fingers tapping lightly on the table in a nervous gesture she had never seen before. Finally, after a long silence, he looked back at her, and the expression he wore was a mixture of tiredness and pain. "Emily, when my father fell ill, he asked me to take care of everything, to ensure that the family legacy continued," he said, his voice lower. "I never planned to follow this path, but I felt it was my duty, and over the years, I have come to accept that this is the only role I can play." Emily realized that, for the first time, he was breaking through her resistance, allowing her to see the complexity of his feelings. She walked over, sitting in front of him, her eyes fixed on his. "I understand that you have taken on an immense responsibility, but does that mean you need to completely erase who you are?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "You don't have to choose between the company and your passion for art, Ethan. There are ways to balance both things." Ethan watched her closely, as if trying to absorb what she was saying, but his expression was still hesitant. He seemed to want to believe, but years of repression and sacrifice had created barriers he didn't know how to overcome. "It's not that simple, Emily," he murmured, looking at their clasped hands. "When you accept a responsibility like this, it is as if your own will ceases to exist. I can't just stray from this path." She took a deep breath, feeling his frustration and the internal conflict he had been carrying. "I knew that for someone like Ethan, recognizing his own needs and desires was difficult, almost impossible. You are punishing yourself for something you did out of love for your family, Ethan," she continued, her voice soft. "What if, for a moment, you considered that there was a middle ground, that you can be the leader your family expects, and at the same time allow yourself to live a part of who you are?" He was silent, eyes downcast, seeming lost in his own thoughts. Those words seemed to penetrate deep into his heart, stirring layers of feelings and desires that he had kept buried for so long. Ethan, for the first time, didn't seem to have a ready answer, a justification for continuing his rigid stance. "But what if I fail?" he murmured, almost to himself, and Emily noticed the tone of vulnerability in his voice. She felt her heart sink when she realized how much he had taken on himself during all those years. She got even closer, placing her hand on his in a gesture of comfort. "We are all afraid of failing, Ethan. But not living your truth is an even greater form of failure," she said, her voice full of tenderness. "And I will be here. I believe in you. I want to help you find that balance if you'll let me." His gaze met hers, and for the first time, there was something broken in his expression, as if his resistance was finally giving way. He intertwined his fingers with hers, the warmth of that touch conveying a security he perhaps had never felt before. The silence between them was no longer cold, but charged with a genuine connection, something that transcended any agreement or obligation. It was as if, in that moment, he finally accepted that he wasn't alone, that he could trust her to help him find a path that united all the parts of himself. After a long moment of silence, Ethan took a deep breath and, with a voice that mixed fragility and determination, began to tell the complete story of his life before taking over the company. He talked about his childhood, the first drawings he made hidden in school notebooks, the years he spent hours in studios, absorbing painting techniques and experimenting with colors. He talked about the dreams he had of one day opening his own gallery and how his life had been full of plans that, in a matter of months, were sacrificed for the good of his family. Emily listened to every word carefully, without interrupting him, absorbing every nuance of his suffering and sacrifice. What she had always perceived as a cold, calculating toughness was, in fact, a defense against the pain of giving up one's future. And now, seeing him open up like that, she understood more than ever that he wasn't the cold man he'd always appeared to be. Ethan was someone who carried a heavy burden, but deep down, longed for a little freedom. When he finished speaking, they both remained silent. Emily felt filled with a mixture of tenderness and respect, as if, by getting to know that side of him, the connection between them had deepened irreversibly. I don't even know why I'm telling you all this," he said, almost with a shy smile, something rare to see on his face. Emily smiled, holding his hand firmly. "Because you needed someone to know. And now that I know, I want to help you find that side of you again, Ethan. It doesn't have to be all at once, but little by little, maybe you can go back to painting, creating, allowing yourself to live it." He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was different, softer and full of gratitude. It was as if, for the first time, he was truly letting someone into his world. "Thank you, Emily," he murmured, squeezing her hand, and his voice carried a tone of deep sincerity. "I never imagined anyone could understand." She returned the squeeze, a light smile lighting up her face. "I think that, deep down, we always understand each other when we learn to listen to what the other is hiding. And I'm here, Ethan, for whatever you need." He pulled her close, in a hug that felt more like a silent plea for support and redemption. Emily felt his warmth and hugged him back, feeling that she had somehow managed to reach the real Ethan, the man who had been hidden behind layers of obligation and fear. From that day on, things started to change between them. Although Ethan remained focused on the company, Emily noticed small signs that he was allowing that creative side to resurface. "I was beginning to notice a sketch here, a notebook there, and even a collection of art books he had brought into the apartment, as if he were trying to rediscover the artist within himself." The conversations between them also became deeper, more open, as if that first step had opened a door that they were both afraid to cross. And every day, Emily felt more involved, not just in the man he was becoming, but in the potential for freedom she saw growing within him. One day, while reviewing some of the drafts of his own projects, he found a small pencil drawing on his desk. It was a sketch of a landscape, full of shadows and subtle lights, with a lightness and depth that only someone passionate about art could create. When she saw that sketch, she felt a silent happiness invade her. "I knew this was Ethan's first step towards something he had suppressed for so long. By showing him that it was possible to balance what he loved with his responsibilities, Emily also felt complete in a way she never expected. Because now, more than partners in a contract, they were For the first time, real companions, sharing dreams, fears, and hopes. The mood in Ethan and Emily's apartment was finally lighter, almost welcoming. Since Ethan had opened up about his past and his frustrations, a genuine complicity had been established between them. It was as if, by finding space for his true passion and sharing his vulnerable side, Ethan had finally let Emily close, breaking down barriers that had kept him trapped in a solitary, controlled role for so long. Weeks passed, and Ethan began to allow himself small moments of creative freedom, something she noticed and encouraged with quiet joy. He still focused on his work and the demands of business, but every now and then, she would see him picking up a sketch pad to sketch out ideas, or getting lost in an art book with an intensity that only someone passionate about their own creation can experience. Could display. Emily was also advancing in her career. She had secured partnerships for her sustainable clothing brand and was receiving invitations to events she had never imagined attending before meeting Ethan. Their professional and personal lives seemed to finally find a balance, and together, they seemed to be building something real and authentic. But that serenity was about to be shaken. One night, while Emily was organizing some materials for a new fashion project in the apartment, her phone rang. He saw it was Lily and hesitated before answering. Although her relationship with Ethan's sister had evolved into something more friendly, Lily still showed some skepticism. The tone of voice on the phone was firm and direct, which immediately put Emily on alert. "Emily, can we meet? I need to talk to you," Lily said bluntly. "Of course, Lily. Do you want me to come to your house?" Emily suggested, trying to sound calm. "No. I'll meet you at Café La Belle in an hour. Be punctual," Lily replied, ending the call before Emily could ask anything else. Bewildered, Emily tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a problem related to the charity exhibition, or something about Lily's work that needed help. However, an instinct told him that it wasn't so simple. When he arrived at the cafe, he found Lily already sitting, her expression tense and her gaze fixed. Lily seemed different from the observant and usually controlled woman. His posture indicated that he was about to reveal something important, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Lily looked up as Emily approached. Her expression was grim, and Emily knew immediately that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "Emily, I'll be direct. I discovered something disturbing about you and Ethan," Lily began bluntly. Emily felt her blood run cold, but she tried to remain calm. "What do you mean, Lily?" Lily took a folder of documents out of her bag, which she threw onto the table with a sharp movement. Emily looked at the papers and recognized with horror the contract she had signed with Ethan at the beginning of it all. He didn't know how Lily had gotten it, but there it was, visible and concrete, laid out before her eyes. "I knew there was something strange between you two," said Lily, her voice low and full of disappointment. "But a marriage contract? Did you really think you could fool everyone with this charade?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. A wave of panic ran through his body. Lily continued to speak, her tone becoming colder. "Ethan is not the only one involved in this. There are very important people who trust him, investors and partners who believe in the image he portrays. If this comes to light, the scandal will be inevitable. His company would lose a lot, Emily, and I can't allow something like that to happen," Lily continued, her eyes fixed on Emily's. Emily swallowed. The weight of that threat was evident. She knew how crucial Ethan's image and investors' trust were to him, especially now that he had begun to accept his artistic side, without compromising the professionalism his position demanded. But if the truth about the contract was revealed, it would destroy his reputation in a second. "Lily, please, let me explain," Emily murmured, her voice shaky but determined. "Explain what?" "That you two deceived everyone, including my family, to achieve your own goals? How do you justify this?" replied Lily, crossing her arms. Emily took a deep breath and tried to choose her words carefully. "When we signed the contract, it was a cold agreement, without personal intentions. Neither of us expected the relationship to go beyond that. But over time, things changed," she said honestly. "I can't deny that it all started as a formality, but Lily, what I feel for Ethan is true now. And as much as you doubt it, he also started to see things differently." Lily remained silent, analyzing every word. Her gaze softened for a brief moment, But the tension soon returned. "Even if I wanted to believe you, Emily, there is still a contract, an agreement that proves this is all an act. If investors and the press find out, it will be the end of Ethan. His image is all he has, and any scandal could end his life's work." Emily felt a growing anguish as she realized the truth in Lily's words. The contract was a real threat to everything Ethan had built. That agreement, which seemed to be the solution to all problems at the beginning, now appeared as a trap. She knew that if the contract was exposed, it would not only affect Ethan's reputation, but also his newly accepted dreams and the path he was finally allowing himself to take. "I don't want to harm Ethan. The last thing I want is for him to suffer the consequences of something that was my choice too," whispered Emily, her voice shaking as she imagined the situation. Lily leaned forward, her gaze stern. "Then make the right choice. Get out of his life before everything falls apart. If you really care about him, Emily, the only thing you can do is leave before it's too late." Lily's words hit her with painful clarity. Leave. Break the contract and leave Ethan free from any suspicion or threat. The idea of disappearing from his life seemed unbearable, but at the same time, she knew it was the only way to ensure that he didn't lose everything he valued so much. Emily left the cafe with an overwhelming feeling of emptiness. She wandered the streets, lost in her thoughts, not knowing where to go. The image of Ethan, with his new dreams and the vulnerable look he had finally allowed her to see, wouldn't leave her mind. He was finally walking a path of self-discovery and freedom, and all of that could be destroyed because of a contract she had accepted in a moment of desperation. When he returned to the apartment that night, he found Ethan focused in his office. His expression relaxed as he made a sketch in his sketchpad. Seeing him in that stillness, immersed in a new creation, made her realize the extent of her impact on him. She knew this man was allowing himself to be himself, because he had finally found a safe space with her. But now, with everything at stake, she felt like an intruder, a threat to his happiness. During dinner, Ethan noticed that she was distant, but he didn't mention anything, respecting her silence. Emily looked at him sadly, recording every detail of his expression, as if she were saying goodbye. "I knew that, soon, I would have to say goodbye to all that, to him, and to the life I had started to build alongside him." The pain was almost unbearable, but at the same time, the decision became clearer in her mind. She would do whatever was necessary to protect him. In the days that followed, Emily began to make plans in silence. He began to collect his belongings little by little, storing everything in a suitcase hidden at the bottom of the closet. Each object packed was a memory, a reminder of the time they spent together, and each one seemed to weigh more than the last. She knew that when she left, she would not only leave Ethan, but also a part of herself. Ethan began to notice changes in her behavior, but with each question, she responded evasively, avoiding confronting him about her intentions. He, in turn, seemed worried, and she saw that he was trying to get closer, trying to understand what was happening. But Emily knew that if he knew the truth about the contract and the threat that hung over him, he would never allow her to leave, and she needed to be strong to protect him, even if it meant lying and carrying the weight of that silent goodbye. On one of the last nights before his departure, they stayed in the living room, in silence, with Ethan drawing and Emily pretending to read a book. She watched him, trying to record every detail, every expression, every line drawn by his hands. It was a silent farewell, and her heart sank every minute. She wished she could tell him everything she felt, that she loved him and that her support would be eternal, but she knew she couldn't. He needed to continue his life, free from any scandal, free to follow the path he had finally found. When the morning of parting arrived, Emily woke up before the sun rose. He picked up his suitcase, which he dragged silently down the hall, and wrote a short letter, leaving it on the office desk. As he looked at the apartment one last time, he felt tears welling up, but he didn't allow them to fall. Walking out the door, she took a deep breath, trying to absorb the pain, leaving everything behind for the love of him, even though he would never understand. In the letter, she simply wrote, "Ethan, I'm leaving so you can follow the path you deserve, without the shadow of the past and a contract that can no longer define us. You are more than you know, and I will always believe in you. even if from afar. With affection, Emily. When Ethan found Emily's letter, the world around him seemed to lose meaning. Reading her words left him breathless, as if each sentence carried the weight of a goodbye that he hadn't allowed to happen. The message was clear. Emily was gone to protect something she believed was bigger than them. However, Ethan knew instinctively that this was not her choice, but rather a sacrifice. And as much as he wanted to respect the decision, an irresistible force pushed him to fight for it. Without hesitation, he grabbed the car keys and sped away. The idea that she could disappear from his life without him even having a chance to explain himself or stop her departure was unbearable. With every kilometer he covered, his heart beat faster as a mixture of anger, despair, and love consumed him. Finally, after searching the city in search of her, he stopped on a quiet street and saw Emily standing in front of a taxi rank, her suitcase at her side. She was holding a phone as if she were trying to call a taxi. But when she saw Ethan's car, her expression turned to a mix of surprise and sadness. He got out of the car and walked towards her, his eyes fixed, his jaw tense, as if he were about to explode. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "Did you really think I would let you go like that, without any explanation?" She looked at him, her hands shaking slightly. She tried to look away, but the intensity of Ethan's gaze seemed to trap her, forcing her to face the reality of everything she was leaving behind. "Ethan, please, I did this to protect you," she murmured, her voice shaking, trying to sound firm. "I can't let something so important to you, your career, your family, be threatened because of this contract." He let out a deep sigh, and his eyes showed the pain and disbelief he was trying to contain. "And who said I need you to decide this for me?" he replied, his voice low but firm. "Do you think I prefer the company, the contracts, the image too?" Emily shuddered and felt her heart tighten at those words. That was everything she wanted to hear, everything she wanted to believe. But the fear of destroying the world he had built was greater. "Ethan, you don't understand. I can't be the person who destroys you. This contract, if exposed, will damage your reputation. And I can't live with this guilt," she said, looking away, as if her own fragility was betraying her. Ethan looked at her, and then, in an unexpected gesture, he grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eyes. "Emily, this is about much more than a contract. I know what it means. I know the risks. And yet, if it means you stay, I accept it all," he said, his voice deep but full of feeling. "Don't you understand that? I'm in love with you?" That confession hit her like a shock, and she felt tears silently run down her face. It was how she felt about him, what she had realized so late. But she knew that her circumstances were too complicated. Both were trapped in different realities, and he, no matter how much he said that, was still a man whose obligations tied him to a rigid world. "Ethan, I'm in love with you too," she whispered, her voice barely coming out, but full of emotion. "But I love you enough to let you go, so you don't lose everything you've built." He closed his eyes, as if those words confirmed what he feared. She was willing to walk out of his life, even though she loved him, even though it hurt her deeply, also that he wouldn't have to deal with the problems she brought. But Ethan, in turn, felt that losing Emily was the real sacrifice, that her absence would leave him empty, regardless of any success. "Then let me decide what I want to sacrifice," he whispered, his voice full of pleading. "Don't let me spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been, what we could have built together." Emily felt the weight of those words, the sincerity and vulnerability he had never exposed before. Still, pride and the need to protect him prevented her from giving in, as if she believed that being strong meant giving up her own happiness. "Ethan, you're going to hate me when it all comes out," she said, trying to smile but failing. "I don't want you to regret it, to look at me with resentment." He cupped her face gently, forcing her to see the intensity in his gaze. "How could I hate you? How could I lose you like this, after everything we've been through?" His voice broke, almost in despair. "Emily, you changed my life. You helped me rediscover who I am. I can't let you go." But she just shook her head, her eyes overflowing with sadness. "I knew that if I gave in, everything could come crashing down." Lily's threat still echoed in his mind, and the consequences were too frightening to ignore. "If you really love me, then let me go, Ethan. And please understand that I'm doing this for both of us," she whispered, trying to smile through her tears, even though her heart was in pieces. They both fell silent, the weight of the moment crushing them. Ethan, his face marked with pain, loosened his grip, allowing her to pull away. She took a step back, and he watched her, as if recording every detail of her face, aware that this was a goodbye he would never get over. She turned around, picked up her suitcase, and started walking slowly. Each step felt like a sacrifice, an open wound that grew with every meter that separated them. Before reaching the corner, she looked back and saw Ethan standing there, watching her silently, with a devastated expression that she would never forget. As I turned the corner, the tears came in force. Each step took her away from the man who had transformed her world and from the love she had found too late. But pride, guilt, and fear kept her from turning back, and all that was left was silent, overwhelming pain. Ethan, still standing on the sidewalk, watched the emptiness she left, the pain invading him like a storm. The love that now filled him seemed useless in the face of parting. He had lost Emily, and perhaps forever. The days following Emily's departure were overwhelmingly empty for Ethan. The apartment, which had once felt like a refuge, now suffocated him with memories of her. He saw Emily in every corner, the smile she always had when making coffee, the soft sound of her laugh, and even the sketches left around the house that she used to plan her collections. Every detail was a memory that insisted on hurting him, constantly reminding him of what he had lost. He tried to get back to his routine, but everything seemed pointless. Work, once his only source of control and fulfillment, had become unbearably monotonous. Every meeting, every negotiation seemed insignificant without her. His colleagues noticed the change in his behavior. The always meticulous and focused Ethan now seemed distracted and impatient, as if he was on the verge of losing control. It was obvious that he had missed something important, although no one dared to ask what was going on. One night, after another long day at the office, Ethan found himself unable to ignore the emptiness any longer. He knew something needed to change, and for the first time in days, he let go of the pride that had kept him stuck in inertia. He picked up the phone and, almost on impulse, called Lily. There was a lot to say, and he knew that if he didn't confront his sister now, he would lose Emily for good. Lily answered quickly, and he could feel her tension on the other end. "Ethan, what happened?" she asked with the same serious and authoritative voice as always. He took a deep breath, trying to contain his tone of frustration. "We need to talk, Lily." Now he replied, without giving details. "Right. Come to my house," she replied, a little hesitantly. Minutes later, Ethan arrived at his sister's house. She was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed and a tense expression, as if she was waiting for a reprimand. He entered and was silent for a moment, watching her with a cold gaze. "You knew Emily left," he began, his voice deep and controlled. "And I know it has something to do with it. What exactly happened, Lily?" Lily hesitated, but then lifted her chin, adopting a defensive posture. "I confronted her, Ethan. I found out about the contract between you two. It was a sham, a deal that, if exposed, could destroy you and the company," she said bluntly. "I spoke to Emily because I thought she would understand the risk, and clearly she understood." Ethan felt his anger rising. Everything was clear now. Emily had left not because she wanted to, but because she believed it was what was best for him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to control himself. "Lily, you don't understand. This wasn't just a contract. What I have with Emily is real," he said, his voice lower but full of emotion. "I love her, and because of you, she thought the best option was to leave, to get away from everything we had built." Lily watched him in silence, and for the first time, her gaze seemed to waver. The hardness on his face lessened, and a shadow of regret appeared in his eyes. "I just wanted to protect you, Ethan. Everything I did was to make sure you didn't harm yourself, that you didn't lose everything you worked so hard for," she murmured, her voice lower and more hesitant. "Protect?" he repeated, almost laughing bitterly. "No protection is worth it if it means losing the person I love. I've never been happier, Lily. And now she's gone, because of a fear you planted." Lily looked away, clearly affected by his words. For the first time, he seemed to understand the impact of his actions. "So, what are you going to do now?" she asked, in a whisper, her voice carrying a touch of guilt. Ethan took a deep breath. finally accepting what he needed to do. "I'm going after her," he replied, without hesitation. "She needs to know the truth. She needs to know that the choice to stay with me is hers, and that I will be by her side, regardless of what happens." Lily nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that she had lost. For a moment, Ethan saw a look of sadness in his sister's eyes, but he had no more time to ponder it. Without saying anything else, he said goodbye and left, with the only thing on his mind finding Emily. After a desperate search, Ethan discovered that Emily was staying at a discreet hotel in the city center. He wasted no time. He drove there, feeling his heart racing, anxiety taking over him. When he finally found the room, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. I could hear footsteps on the other side, and then the door opened, revealing Emily. She seemed surprised and, at the same time, scared to see him there. Her expression was a mix of longing and pain, as if the sight of Ethan pulled her back to feelings she was trying to move away from. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely coming out. "I came to tell you that you made a mistake leaving," he replied, entering the room without waiting for an invitation. "Emily, please listen. I know what Lily told you. I know she used the contract to scare you, to make you believe that it would be better to leave me, but none of that matters to me. The only thing that matters is you." She looked at him in disbelief, as if his words were impossible to believe. He approached, taking her hands in his, trying to convey the sincerity of his feelings. "You showed me something I didn't know existed in me, a part that I buried, that I ignored. And now, without you, I realize that nothing I've achieved has value if I don't have you by my side," he continued, his voice breaking. Emily felt the tears welling up again. Part of her wanted to give in, run into his arms and accept the love he offered her. But the fear was still there, persistent, reminding her of all the implications of that contract. "Ethan, what if this ends up hurting you? What if all this comes to light? I don't want to be the reason for your downfall," she said, almost as a last plea for him to understand. He shook his head decisively and cupped her face gently. "There is no risk that I am not willing to take to have you, and if I have to deal with the consequences, I will do it with my head held high, because I choose you, Emily, always," he whispered, his eyes fixed on hers. She realized then that there were no more barriers, no pride or fear that could separate them. The strength with which he looked at her, the intensity of his words, were proof that he was willing to face any challenge to be with her. And at that moment, she knew she couldn't run anymore. Without saying a word, Emily threw herself into Ethan's arms, tears flowing freely, but now with a different emotion, relief, joy, and the knowledge that finally, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He hugged her tightly, as if he wanted to protect her from all the fear, from all the uncertainties. He felt her heart beating faster, and that comforted him, bringing the peace he had sought so much since her departure. When they finally pulled away, they both looked at each other in silence, smiling through their tears, knowing there was nothing more to say. Ethan held her hand and kissed it, sealing the commitment they both had decided to carry, not through a contract, but through the true love they had found. In the days that followed, both dedicated themselves to rebuilding everything with care and love, balancing the professional and personal lives that they valued so much. They knew they would still face challenges, but together, they were ready to face them. That night, the silence between them was filled with tension and unspoken emotions, as if the words trapped for weeks were finally about to emerge. Ethan and Emily were alone in the apartment, and they both felt uneasiness growing in the air. He had brought her back home days before, convincing her that nothing was more important than how they felt about each other. But since then, the vulnerability of their feelings, so recent and intense, left an uncertainty between them. Emily feared trusting completely, while Ethan, dealing with his own resistance and pride, was hesitant to open up completely to her. They were in the living room, sitting opposite each other. Ethan had his eyes fixed on an indeterminate point, as if trying to sort out the thoughts that tormented him, while Emily watched him sideways, her heart racing. She knew he wanted to say something, but whatever it was, it seemed too difficult for him to admit. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked her straight in the eyes, as if he had reached the limit of restraint. "Emily, I need to be honest with you," he began, his voice firm, but his gaze vulnerable, revealing a side of him that she rarely saw. "Since the day you left, I've never been able to stop thinking about you." Emily felt a pang of emotion when she heard those words, but she held herself back. He still carried the scars from leaving, and no matter how many times he had returned, the fear of getting hurt again was still there. The doubt about how far Ethan was willing to go and whether his commitment to her was truly unwavering made her hesitant. "Ethan," she murmured, trying to find the words, but her voice broke and she looked away, fighting her own emotions. "You don't understand how difficult it was to leave. I was trying to do what's best for you, so you wouldn't come to harm with me. And when Lily confronted me about the contract, everything fell apart." He came closer, leaning a little closer to her, his eyes fixed, determined. "I understand why you made that decision, Emily, and I also understand that I was wrong to allow doubt to creep in between us. To let fear stop me from telling you what I really feel," he admitted, his voice full of sincerity. "But the truth is that I never stopped thinking about you, not even for a moment. And since you came back, I know I can't lose you again." Emily felt his words pierce through all her defenses, each syllable filled with an honesty she always wanted to hear. The pain of his departure, which she thought was insurmountable, now seemed to dissipate under the intensity of his gaze. But she didn't want to deceive herself. As much as he wanted to believe, he still feared that this was all just a phase, that he might retreat again at the first sign of difficulty. "Ethan, I don't want to be hurt again," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "When I left, I thought it would be the end, that we would never see each other again. And I tried to convince myself that it was for the best. I don't want to go through this again. I need to know that you are truly willing to be here. Not just for a moment, but truly here, with me." He reached out, holding her hand gently, the touch warm and comforting. And there, in that simple gesture, Emily noticed an intensity that he had always been reluctant to show. "I know I made you doubt, Emily, and I am deeply sorry. But I'm here now, and I'm ready for anything," he confessed, his eyes filled with a weight that only she could understand. "I was torn for a long time, thinking I should keep up appearances, but that is over. Nothing makes sense without you, and if that means facing any challenge together, that's what I want to do." She looked at him, taking in every word, every confession. That was the proof he had always sought. Ethan was finally willing to give himself up, to let go of the reservations that had imprisoned him and face whatever came his way, as long as he was with her. The relief and happiness this brought her moved her deeply, but at the same time, she was still afraid of letting herself go completely. "I want that too, Ethan," she admitted, squeezing his hand and letting a tear escape, which she quickly wiped away. "But I can't just forget the past. I don't want to live in fear that one day you might regret all of this." He moved closer, placing his other hand over hers, as if he were protecting and supporting her at the same time. "I will never regret it, Emily. As difficult as the path to this point has been, I know that you are what I always wanted, even before I realized it. This contract, the formalities, all of this means nothing now. What matters is what we feel and what we want to build together," he said, his voice full of conviction. These words touched her deeply. He felt the weight of the fear he carried begin to dissipate, and little by little, he allowed himself to believe. Ethan's expression, his tone, and his closeness made her feel safe. Perhaps finally, they had found the balance between love and the challenges they had faced. She let out a light sigh, letting the tiredness and tension disappear. Without thinking, she approached him and wrapped him in a tight hug, feeling his presence surrounding her like a shield. There, in his arms, she felt at peace, as if she had finally found her place. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, barriers and insecurities melting away. Ethan held her like she was the only thing that mattered, while she allowed her fear to melt into the warmth of his affection. And in that instant, they knew that what they had was unbreakable. Finally, Ethan pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes once more. "Emily, I promise you we won't miss this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "No matter what comes, no matter what we need to face, I am here, and I will be by your side always." She smiled, feeling her heart warm with the promise he made. And for the first time since this all started, she knew she could trust him, that he was truly willing to fight for them. Without another word, they kissed. And in that kiss there was all the trust, all the love, and the certainty that they were ready to face everything together. The phone rang while Emily was adjusting fabric swatches for a new campaign. The customer's voice on the line was cold, almost indifferent, but his words made her freeze. "Emily, here's the thing," he began directly without any delicacy. "I heard about your relationship with Ethan Cooper, and quite frankly, I don't want my name or my company associated with that kind of involvement. If you want to continue with our partnership, you will have to reconsider your choice of company. I expect a clear position on this by the end of the week." She fell silent, surprised by the client's lack of tact, but even more frightened by what he was suggesting. It was an unthinkable proposition. A choice between a professional contract important to her career and the man she had finally admitted to loving. And the weight of those words fell on her, making everything she and Ethan had built uncertain again. As soon as she hung up, Emily remained still, processing the client's proposal. He knew that this was one of the most promising contracts for his brand, and that he could leverage it to new markets and investors. It was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of since he began his career as a fashion designer, and losing the client could mean a huge blow to his plans. But at the same time, choosing success over Ethan was an unthinkable idea. She tried to continue the work, but insecurity suffocated her, and with each attempt, her thoughts pulled her back to the same question. If she continued this relationship, her name could be tarnished in the eyes of many. But abandoning it felt like an even greater betrayal, not just to Ethan, but to the love they were building. Hours later, she could no longer ignore the need to talk to him. There was a strength in Ethan that she had never stopped admiring, and perhaps he could show her a way out. When she arrived at the apartment, he greeted her with a tired but warm smile. However, upon seeing her serious expression, his expression changed to concern. "Emily, what happened?" he asked, noticing the tension evident on her face. She hesitated, her heart heavy at what she was about to reveal. "Today, an important client asked me to choose between the campaign and you," she confessed, her voice weak, almost whispering. "He made it clear that he does not want to associate his company with you, due to rumors that emerged about our relationship. He wants me to end everything between us if he wants to continue the campaign." Ethan was silent, but the impact of that information was visible. His expression turned dark, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, as if trying to absorb the weight of her words. Emily could see the frustration on his face, the anger at once again being a pawn in a game that disrespected her feelings and her freedom. "I don't want you to lose your career because of me, Emily," he said, his voice low and full of seriousness. "But I also can't just let you make that choice alone. That's not fair, and I won't accept someone making us choose that way." She took a deep breath, noticing his strength and the determination in his words. But as much as she wanted to believe that they could face everything together, fear still haunted her. It was as if all the love they had built could fall apart because of external forces they had no control over. "Ethan, my career means a lot to me. I fought so hard to build my brand, to get here," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But none of this makes sense without you. The idea of losing you, I don't know how to face it." He walked over, taking her hands in his and bringing her close. The warmth of his touch comforted her, and she could see the sincerity in his eyes, a gleam of courage that made her feel safe. "Emily, this is just another obstacle, and we can overcome it together. Your career is important, yes, and I want you to be successful, but don't let a client or anyone dictate how you should live your life," he replied, his voice low and intense. "I'm not afraid to face the consequences of what we feel. The world will always have something to say, but the only thing that matters is what we want to build together." His words enveloped her like a shield, but she still felt the pain of the choice she would have to make. Ethan seemed ready to face her, to protect what they had. She knew he was right, that their love was strong enough to endure, but the sacrifice of perhaps losing an important contract still weighed on her. "What if I lose this contract, Ethan? What if this puts everything I've worked for at risk?" she asked, her voice choked with insecurity. He caressed her face, looking at her with a sincere affection that seemed to dispel all uncertainty. "If losing this contract means that you chose to be true to how you feel, then it will have been a worthwhile sacrifice," he said, his tone firm and assured. "A long time ago, I subjected myself to choices that took me away from what I really wanted. But I won't let you lose yourself in the same way. You are the woman I love, and no one will take that away from us." Emily realized that he didn't just support her. He was willing to expose himself, to face the world alongside her, without fear of the repercussions. The love they felt, although it defied everything they considered safe, was the only certainty they had. She hugged him, feeling overcome with a mixture of relief and hope. At that moment, he understood that true success would be building a life in which both could be authentic, even if that meant facing the consequences. As much as she loved her career, nothing compared to the love they shared, and she knew Ethan was willing to face everything alongside her. The next morning, Emily made a decision. With a heavy heart, but certain that he had made the right choice, he contacted the client. "Thank you for the opportunity, but I believe that this campaign does not align with the values of my brand and the path I want to follow," she said, her voice firm and determined. "I wish the project success, but I will not be able to continue." The client tried to argue, but Emily remained unyielding, finally feeling free from an imposition that would have robbed her of much more than a simple contract. He hung up the phone with a feeling of peace, knowing that no matter how much he lost that client, he had gained something much bigger. That night, when she told Ethan about the decision, he saw the admiration and pride on her face. He held her tightly, and together they promised that, from now on, they would face everything side by side, without any more fears or doubts. The weeks that followed were full of challenges and also growth. Emily's decision, while difficult, brought new opportunities, and her dedication to the brand and the love she shared with Ethan seemed to open unexpected doors. They built a new reality together, in which they could both support each other and grow, without fear of difficult choices. And together, they found the strength to build a more meaningful life, where the love and respect they felt for each other were unshakable. The decision to leave the contract behind brought a lightness that neither Ethan nor Emily had experienced before. For the first time, they truly felt free to start over, without the constraints of appearances or formalities. Now, everything between them was authentic. Every look, every touch, every word exchanged. The tension of the past seemed a distant shadow, and the future, once so uncertain, now shone with promise and possibility. With Ethan's unwavering presence by her side, Emily began to dedicate herself to a new project she had been nurturing in secret. A fashion collection inspired by her own journey, a reflection of the difficult choices, fears overcome, and love she had finally found. It was a bold, very personal project, and therefore the most challenging I had ever faced. Each piece would be a representation of the most profound and emotional moments in her life, from the beginning of her contract to that new beginning alongside Ethan. One quiet evening, sitting on the couch in his apartment, Ethan watched Emily work on some sketches, her face illuminated by the soft light of a lamp, her gaze focused and passionate. He couldn't help but smile when he saw her so committed, so immersed in what she loved to do. "This collection is going to be a success, Emily," he said, softly, interrupting the silence with a confidence that made her look up at him, surprised. Emily smiled, still shy about his absolute confidence. She knew Ethan's support was sincere, but at the same time, the weight of putting her own story into a collection left her vulnerable. "Sometimes I wonder if people will understand what I'm trying to say," she confessed, putting her pencil aside and interlacing her fingers. "I want these pieces to be more than just clothes. I want them to convey feelings, to tell a true story. It leaves me exposed." Ethan looked at her, understanding what she felt. He knew how much this project meant to her and how much this vulnerability could scare her. He approached her, holding her hands firmly. "Emily, your story is what makes this collection special. You lived every moment of these pieces, and that sincerity is what will connect people to your work. Trust that. Trust yourself," he said, his voice low but firm. She felt his encouragement strengthen her resolve, and suddenly the doubt seemed to melt away. With Ethan by her side, she believed she could overcome any obstacle. He was more than her support. It was the inspiration for her courage and authenticity. As the weeks passed, the collection took shape, and each piece was more intense and meaningful than the last. Emily dedicated herself to every detail, from the choice of fabrics to the combinations of colors and textures. Each dress, coat, and ensemble told a part of their story. The uncertainties at the beginning, the cold contract that brought them together, the tension of unrequited love, the fear of separation, and finally, liberation. There was one piece in particular, a flowing dark blue silk dress that represented the turning point between them, the moment when love was stronger than pride. It was the central piece, the most delicate and most expressive of the collection. Ethan followed each phase of the process, admiring her strength and passion. Whenever she showed him a new sketch, he listened intently, commenting on every detail enthusiastically. Their understanding and unwavering support were confirmation that, this time, they were building something solid and real. He was also inspired to resume his own artistic creations, something he had put aside for years to dedicate himself to the family business. The complicity between the two was visible. They worked in harmony, supporting each other in their personal projects and encouraging each other to achieve their dreams. The big day of the collection's launch finally arrived, and Emily felt a mix of nervousness and euphoria. She had decided to do something different. She organized an intimate fashion show, with few guests, choosing the same art gallery where she had seen Ethan's paintings. She felt that that space carried the energy of their love, of their shared history, and was the perfect place for what she wanted to present. It was like a circle that finally closed, a cycle of challenges and overcoming that culminated in that moment. The gallery was transformed. Ethan's paintings, including some new ones he had recently created, covered the walls, serving as a symbolic backdrop to the parade. She knew this was his way of reaffirming his support for her and showing that they were connected at every stage of this new beginning. Selected guests, including friends, stylists, and fashion critics, filled the room with murmurs of expectation, while Emily and Ethan exchanged knowing glances, each sensing the other's nervousness. He was by her side, and his presence calmed her. When the lights dimmed and the first model walked onto the runway, Emily felt her heart race. Each piece seemed to come to life to the sound of the soft music that echoed throughout the room, while guests attentively observed every detail. The collection was sophisticated and elegant, but with an emotional charge that made it unique. Each fabric flowed, each color and each texture told part of a story that, until that moment, only she and Ethan knew in depth. At the end of the parade, when the dark blue dress appeared, there was a collective sigh among those present. The piece seemed to dance down the runway, and even Ethan felt the impact of that last piece. It was as if all the love and shared journey were represented there, visible to everyone. Emily watched, moved, each reaction. That piece was his soul, his fight, and above all, his surrender to the love that he now lived without reservations. When the lights came on and applause filled the room, Ethan was the first to hug her, his eyes overflowing with pride and love. "You did it, Emily. You did it," he said, his voice full of emotion. She smiled through tears of happiness, feeling complete. For the first time, everything felt right. Every sacrifice, every choice. It wasn't just a fashion show, but a celebration of her truth, her strength, and her love. After the show, Emily and Ethan received compliments from guests impressed with the collection. But for them, that moment was much more than a professional success. It was the beginning of a new phase, where they no longer needed to hide what they felt or worry about other people's judgments. They knew that together they could face any challenge, and that, for the first time, they were both living fully free from contracts and doubts. Later, as the night progressed and the gallery emptied, they walked to the last piece in the collection, the blue dress that represented the love and resilience they experienced. They remained silent for a moment, side by side, observing the piece and everything it meant. Ethan pulled her close, wrapping her in a hug, and without saying anything, sealed the moment with a soft kiss, but full of promise. "For us, Emily, no more secrets, no more reservations," he whispered, his tone soft and full of meaning. She hugged him back, feeling safe and happy. The uncertainty was gone, and the only thing left was true, unwavering love. Together, they were ready for the future, willing to build an authentic life where they could both be who they really were. This was the new beginning they had always sought, and with hands clasped, they walked together to face the world as partners, lovers, and ultimately, as themselves. The night of the launch of Emily's collection, scheduled for the press and the public, arrived surrounded by a mix of euphoria and expectation. This time, the event was big and sophisticated, with the presence of journalists, fashion critics, investors, and celebrities from the fashion world. The success of the show at the gallery had generated overwhelming interest, and the collection was about to gain visibility that Emily had never imagined. She had worked tirelessly for that moment, and next to Ethan, she felt ready to share the stage of life with him, without fear and without secrets. The entrance to the ballroom was filled with photographers and guests in impeccable attire. But the center of attention was undeniably Emily. She looked stunning in a simple yet elegant white silk dress that hugged her body delicately. Beside her, Ethan displayed classic elegance in his black suit. His hand was firmly on her back, demonstrating to the world his unconditional support and solid presence. The love between them was evident, but what no one knew was that Ethan had planned a surprise that would mark that event forever. As the guests settled down, Emily, nervous and excited, exchanged glances with Ethan, who encouraged her with a calm smile. He seemed perfectly calm, but the gleam in his eyes indicated something beyond simple pride. Deep down, she felt there was a different energy that night, but she was so caught up in the anticipation of the launch that she didn't question it. Soon, soft music began, signaling that the show was about to begin, and Emily and Ethan split up to watch the performance from opposite seats on the catwalk. The collection paraded impeccably under the intense lights. Each piece, each carefully planned detail, reflected the essence of Emily and the journey that had led her there. The collection was not only an artistic expression, but a representation of her strength and the transformation that Ethan's love had brought to her life. The audience's reaction was visible, a mixture of admiration and enchantment, and the applause at the end echoed throughout the hall, confirming the resounding success. Emily felt tears threatening to fall as she welcomed the applause. She couldn't believe she had come this far, and she knew she wouldn't have made it without Ethan's unwavering support. At the end of the parade, while applause still filled the room, the master of ceremonies called Emily to the stage for a brief speech. With a beaming smile and a slight tremor of emotion, she walked to the microphone, taking a deep breath before beginning. "This collection is not just about fashion," she said, her voice clear but full of emotion. "She is a part of me, an expression of everything I have lived and overcome. I thank everyone who supported me, especially the man who helped me to be stronger and believe in myself." She glanced at Ethan, who was in the background, and his eyes held the same intensity as always. Ethan was serious, but there was a spark of emotion in his gaze that made her smile fondly. She had almost finished her speech, but suddenly he started walking towards the stage, and eyes turned to him in surprise. Ethan took the stage, and without letting go of Emily's eyes, took the microphone, causing absolute silence in the room. The audience expected some statement about the parade or a brief speech of support, but instead, Ethan turned completely to her, his eyes shining with a mix of passion and seriousness that made her catch her breath. "Emily," he began, his voice deep and full of emotion, "tonight is about you, about the talent and courage you have always had. But for me, it's much more. Being by your side taught me what it means to be true, to fight for what really matters." He paused, looking at her with a depth that left her speechless, while the guests watched, perplexed. "I hid behind contracts and responsibilities for too long," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "But today, I want to make it clear to everyone here that there are no more secrets between us, no fears, no doubts. Emily, you are everything I ever wanted, and if you let me, I want to spend the rest of my life by your side." Emily felt her heart racing and her breath was short. His words were more than a statement. They were a public promise of love and loyalty, a complete declaration that he was giving himself to her entirely, without reservation. And to her surprise and shock, he knelt right there, in the center of the stage, taking the small velvet box from his pocket. A murmur of astonishment ran through the audience, but Ethan seemed oblivious to everything and everyone, completely focused on Emily, his eyes fixed on hers. "Emily, will you agree to marry me?" he asked, his voice low and full of emotion. She looked at him, tears flowing freely now, without any shame in showing how she felt. That moment was the realization of everything they had overcome together. Every obstacle, every sacrifice, and every choice. Without hesitation, she shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Yes, Ethan, I accept," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. The audience erupted in applause, and many stood up to applaud the couple. Ethan stood up and, carefully holding Emily's face, kissed her amid applause, sealing the promise of a life together. At that moment, nothing else mattered other than the love that united them and the happiness that surrounded them. When they finally pulled away, Emily felt at peace. It was as if everything they had experienced up to that point, all the difficulties, culminated in this new stage of their lives. They weren't just a couple in love. They were partners, accomplices, and from that moment on, also a family. In the days that followed, the public marriage proposal became news, circulating in industry newspapers and magazines. The couple had become the center of attention in the world of fashion and business, inspiring headlines about the union of two people who not only shared love, but also a vision for life and work. Alongside Ethan, Emily launched the collection with a success that exceeded all her expectations. The repercussion was not just professional. Her story and her transparency moved the public and made her a respected and admired figure. Ethan, in turn, began to rediscover his own passion for art, balancing his life between work at the company and his personal creations. Emily's support encouraged him to explore that side he had repressed for so long, and together they began to pursue projects that combined their talents, creating a legacy that reflected the love and authenticity they had found. At the wedding, held months later, the ceremony was intimate and full of symbolism that represented everything they experienced. Friends and family surrounded them, and to the sound of soft music, they exchanged heartfelt and emotional vows, promising to stay together no matter the challenges. The party was full of joy, laughter, and dancing, and the looks they exchanged showed the world that, despite the challenges, they had found unbreakable happiness. Over time, their story became known as an inspiration, proof that true love is capable of overcoming obstacles and uncertainties and transforming lives in profound ways. Emily and Ethan built a successful career together, but more than that, they built a life of love, respect, and mutual support, becoming an unshakable force. And with each new project, each achievement, they remembered the path that brought them together, knowing that their love was the foundation of everything they had become.